Chapter 535. I was just guessing. Su Yurong gazed at the distant horizon, where the twilight and snowflakes mingled, her beautiful face revealing a faint yearning. Since people like teacher and martial Uncle Su have decided to leave this world, beside the place of legend like the sacred light continent, where else would they go? Chun Changsheng was quiet for a while, then asked, "How do I get to the sacred light continent? How do I get to the fortune piece road? How do I get to the bridge of helplessness? How do I get to the Orthodox Academy? How do I get to the Li Palace? How do I get to that place of legend?" This question was actually rather absurd, but his expression was very serious. Su Yurong was also very serious, carefully recalling the conversation between the Divine Empress and her teacher when they were small. After a very long time, she uncertainly said 2 words, "Cloud Grave." Chun Changsheng fell silent once more, but this silence lasted much longer than before. The Cloud Grave was the grave of all the clouds in this world, the most remote place of the continent. That place never saw the sun, making it incomparably mysterious and unknown. But he was very familiar with the Cloud Grave. He knew that in those countless clouds, there was an incomparably tall mountain. The mountain pierced through the clouds, leading to some unknown place. Because that mountain was 300 li behind Xining village, he had been there before. He knew that in the wetlands of the mountain peak shrouded in clouds and mist hid countless ferocious monsters, countless dangerous cultivators, as well as some bitter survivors of the previous dynasty. Only today did he know that this mountain peak might have been a path to another world. In the future, let's go to the sacred light continent together and take a look, he very seriously asked Su Yurong. Even if the legend was true that there really was a place called the sacred light continent on the other side of the Sea of Stars, since no one had ever known of it, it meant that no one had ever succeeded in breaking through the barrier of space and finding that world. He and Su Yurong were both cultivating geniuses, but they were still very far from the divine domain. To them, the sacred light continent was just an illusory name and a guess. Yet he had very seriously sent out his invitation, perhaps several hundred years in advance. At this moment, he had long ago forgotten that he might not live past 20. Su Yurong smiled. Okay, Qin Changxing thought, really good. Upon returning to the Orthodox Academy and entering the first floor, he was somewhat surprised to discover that Zheshio's room was open and that Su Moyu and the others were inside. "What are you talking about?" He walked in curiously. "Su Mo, you said, since this morning, Tang Tang has been asking people if love at first sight really exists in this world." Tang 36 looked at Chun Changsheng and sneered. Chun Changsheng became nervous and asked, "Why did you suddenly mention this?" "Who knows what happened to him today?" Xianyuan said with some grievance. I answered him seriously, but he scolded me instead. Zheshio stood by the window and suddenly said, "Suli has left. She should still be at Mount Li, right?" Qin Changsheng was shocked. He thought that he had been found out that he was with Su Yurong, but in the next moment, he realized that he was actually trying to confirm the answer. The information brought by the southern ambassadors should be accurate. When Tang 36 said this, he glanced at Chun Changsheng again. Chun Changsheng ignored him and asked Zheshio with concern, "What do you plan to do?" In the current Orthodox Academy, from the principal to the director to the head of logistics to the instructors, they were all extremely young. Not a single one was over 20. They were all young, and what they cared about the most was the bone-deep beauty and sorrow of young people. Besides the engagement and battle between Chun Changsheng and Su Yurong, there was also the story of Zheshio and Qijian. Zheshio looked at the snow outside the window, a hint of viciousness flashing across his face that still carried a hint of inexperience despite being weathered by wind and snow. "Once I finish my business in the capital, I'll go to Mount Li to pick her up." Chun Changsheng and the others looked at each other. They had heard very clearly that Zheshio had not used the word look, but pick up. They seemed to be able to see the countless battles that would take place on Mount Li in the future, those mottled wolf blood. Zheshio was seeking death, but the problem was that no one in this world could stop him from seeking death. Tang 36 did not want Zheshio to enter a crazed state of mind, so he shot a glance at Su Moyu and asked, What business do you want to take care of in the capital? Su Mo, you understood, thinking, no matter how Zheshio answers, we have to make this matter a little more difficult. Only in this way can we delay Zheshio from going to Mount Li to throw away his life. I want to kill Zhou Tong. Zheshio turned around and expressionlessly said to them. The room was very quiet. After a moment of silence, Tang 36 said, then let's all disperse. In any case, this isn't something that can be settled in 8 or 10 years. Not long after the crowd dispersed, he came to Chun Changsheng's room. Not minding that he was covered in snow and mud, he bluntly sat down on the bed that was so clean that not even a single strand of hair could be found. He then pointed at Qin Changsheng and said with absolute certainty, there's no such thing as love at first sight in this world. Chun Changsheng glanced at the muddy water dripping from the hem of his clothes, controlled his emotions, and said, just what are you trying to say? Oh, I wasn't precise enough. Of course it's possible that you fell in love with Su Yurong at first sight. Even someone as perfect as Qiu Shanjun, someone that even I am somewhat envious of, had such a deep love for her, let alone a little boy like you who has never experienced the matters between a man and a woman. Tang 36 looked at him and said, but it's absolutely impossible for her to fall in love with you at first sight, so there's a problem with this matter. Qin Changsheng didn't really care about this problem, but he was rather curious, so he asked, why can't she? Tang 36 pointed at the dressing table by the wall and said, go look in the mirror. Qin Changsheng really did as he was told and walked over. Looking at himself in the mirror, he said, I'm not ugly. Tang 36 opened his mouth, but he was completely speechless. He once again confirmed that Su Yurong and Chun Changsheng really were both people that made people speechless. Qin Changsheng looked at himself in the mirror and began to chuckle. Tang 36 angrily yelled, in any case, it's impossible for her to fall in love with you at first sight on the bridge of helplessness. Even if it's because of the engagement that she's imagined you many times, it's still impossible because you're just not ugly. You're far from being good-looking, and you're definitely not as good-looking as me. Qin Changsheng turned to look at him and asked, and then? Tang 36 stood up and walked in front of him. Staring into his eyes, he said, I'm worried that she has some sort of plan for you. No matter who it was, as long as they didn't know the story of the Garden of Zhou, once they discovered that Su Yurong and Chun Changsheng were dating, they would definitely feel that there was a problem. Qin Changsheng understood, so he didn't have any resistance, much less anger. He comforted, relax, it's fine. His words were very natural, but very firm. Seeing his expression, Tang 36 fell silent for a while, then suddenly said, you've met before. Qin Changsheng thought about Su Yurong's orders and shook his head. Tang 36 sneered, she wouldn't have fallen in love with you at first sight, but she did. This means that it wasn't the first time you've met. This reasoning could be said to be full of flaws, but it was also impeccable. Qin Changsheng didn't know what to do, so he explained, when we were young, we exchanged letters, so we can't be considered strangers. Lie, keep lying. Tang 36 expressionlessly said to him. Qin Changsheng really had no other choice. He looked at him and earnestly pleaded, then you have to keep this a secret. You can't tell anyone. Tang 36's expression instantly relaxed. He walked up and put his arm around Qin Changsheng's shoulder, not forgetting to close the window. Arching his brows, he said, who am I? You still can't relax with me? If he really were to tell this story, big and small, again and again, how long would it take? How many words? How many? After hearing what had happened in the Garden of Zhou, Tang 36 was so shocked that he didn't speak for a very long time. Finally, he looked at Qin Changsheng and let out the same sigh. Are you a pig? Qin Changsheng was very ashamed. He didn't have the confidence to refute those words. He thought of another matter and asked, I don't understand why she doesn't want me to tell anyone else. Tang 36 was very speechless. You don't even understand? You really are a pig. After being scolded twice, Qin Changsheng still felt somewhat uncomfortable. He said, didn't she also not recognize me in the Garden of Zhou? That's why it's said that fate is preordained by the heavens. The two of you are called fate made by the heavens. Tang 36 opened the window and gazed at the starry sky after the snow had stopped and the clouds had dispersed. He was deeply moved. Chen Changsheng was very happy to hear these words. "Thank you for your blessing." Tang 36 turned around and sternly said, "You and Su Yurong are like a male pig and a female pig. Of course you're very compatible." Su Li's 2 letters were very strange. The moment he took the letters, Chen Changsheng was sure of this fact. So he did not open them in front of Su Yurong. Instead, he waited until the dead of night and then walked alone to the kitchen across the lake. After making all sorts of preparations, he used the stainless sword to cut them open. The stainless sword could be said to be the sharpest sword in the world. It very easily cut a thin line out of the yellow envelope. But his brow creased because he could clearly sense that when the stainless sword's edge had traveled through the envelope, it had encountered countless extremely thin and tenacious strands of qi. These strands of qi were like tough iron bars. If the stainless sword had not been sharp enough, then with his current level of cultivation, it would have been impossible for him to cut open the envelope. He took a few deep breaths, calmed his mind, and then took the letter out of the envelope. It was a thin, ordinary letter, but when he unfolded it and used the dim light of the firewood to read it, countless tiny strands of sword intent gushed out of the letter, transforming into countless snowflakes outside the house, or like willow leaves falling from the Luo River at the end of summer. Swish, 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 swish. Countless sharp and even somewhat mournful noises resounded around him. These were all sword intents. The iron pot on the stove was instantly chopped into countless pieces. The ceramic tiles on the stove were chopped into pieces, and soon after, the firewood by the stove was also chopped into pieces. The firewood burning in the stove was also chopped into pieces, sparks flying in all directions. Even the burning embers seemed to be chopped into pieces by those sword intents. Chen Changsheng stood amidst the drifting sword intents, his expression solemn, not daring to move. Chapter 536. Chen Changsheng had long since been prepared for the sword intents that Su Li had hidden in the letter. At the very beginning, he had wanted to see how long he could resist after his return to the capital, which had increased his cultivation by quite a bit. However, he had never imagined that the sword intents in the letter would be so sharp and terrifying. Let alone resisting, he didn't even dare to touch them. Of course, Su Li did not have any malice towards him, much less any killing intent. The sword intents that floated up from the letter noiselessly chopped up many things in the kitchen, and even chopped off a piece of his floating belt. However, not a single sword intent landed on his body, only dancing around him. The sword intents danced around his body like falling leaves, snowflakes, and droplets of water. Chen Changsheng felt like he was standing under an autumn tree, under a snowy sky, under a waterfall. He vaguely understood something and gradually relaxed his mind, sending his spiritual sense into the world formed from sword intents. These sword intents were the letter that Su Li had given him, one of the gifts that he had left for him. Then what was written on the letter? As Chen Changsheng comprehended the sword intents that Su Li had left behind after his breakthrough, he quietly read the letter. Su Li's handwriting was just like his person and his sword, free and unrestrained, happy and sharp. The strokes were extremely steep, and the strokes were extremely sharp. You were actually able to defeat Yurong. This is truly surprising news. Upon seeing the first sentence on the letter, Chen Changsheng finally understood that Su Li had given him a letter with conditions. The precondition was that he had to defeat Su Yurong. If he could not do this, Su Li would definitely be disappointed in him. And then these 2 letters might have been left for Su Yurong, or perhaps Qiushan Jun. But when I think about how your sword could be considered to have been taught by me, then it's understandable that you could barely defeat Yurong. The words that Su Li had written in the letter still perfectly displayed his self-confidence, or perhaps his narcissism. But after that, his words became much calmer, much more indifferent. In my life, I've only taught 3 people, Qiushan, you, and Qi Jian. Qiushan is stronger than you, Qi Jian is weaker than you, and she's also my daughter. After I leave, if something happens to Mount Li, help me take care of her. As for why I left, when you live for a few hundred years and realize that someone has been waiting for you for a few hundred years, perhaps you will understand. I am the junior martial uncle of Mount Li. I do not need to explain anything to the disciples of the mountain. I am Su Li. I do not need to explain anything to old man Yin or Tian Hai, but I still want to explain a few things, tell them a few things, so I wrote this letter to you. If anyone asks, you could tell them what I said. I didn't admit defeat to this world, but she was right. I am Su Li, so why should I be the second, Zhou, asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Most importantly, you're right. I've killed countless people. I have no love for this world, but perhaps I still have a shred of kindness? Seeing this sentence, Chen Changsheng's heart was filled with many emotions. In the view of many people, especially those Southerners who opposed the confluence of the North and South, Su Li and the Holy Maiden drifting away was an extremely irresponsible escape. Who could understand that for a person like Su Li, only by clinging to the sword of true wisdom and courage could he cut open this path of departure? But when he reached the end of the letter, he suddenly felt that his praise and admiration for Senior Su Li seemed wrong. At the end of the letter, Su Li wrote these words, "Make that wolf cub give up on that idea. If he dares to bother my daughter again, even if I'm on the other side of the sea of stars, I will ride the star chariot back and first kill him with one strike, then kill you with one strike, and finally exterminate your Orthodox Academy and that wolf tribe in the north. Don't say I didn't warn you." After Chen Changsheng finished reading these words, he helplessly thought to himself, why can a free and unrestrained person like Senior Su Li take this matter so seriously? As he was thinking this, the air around him suddenly began to resound with the terrifying cries of swords. Countless sword intents returned from every direction and fell upon the letter. Those extremely sharp and profound sword intents of an unfathomable level chopped the handwriting on the letter into pieces, transforming it into innumerable blobs of ink that could no longer be clearly seen. Those blobs of ink ultimately transformed into 4 large words. Burn after reading. Chen Changsheng stared blankly at these 4 words. He felt that if he just burned it like this, wouldn't it be a pity? It must be known that the sword intent on this letter was an incomparably precious gift to those who cultivated the sword. He had originally planned to have Tang 36, Zhexiu, and the others come tomorrow to comprehend it. But since it was Su Li's order, he could not oppose it. He very obediently threw the letter into the embers of the stove and watched as the letter was burned to ash. As he gazed at the ash in the stove and thought of the sword intent on the letter, he suddenly thought of the all-school martial exhibition a few days ago, when those initial-level star condensation experts came to challenge the Orthodox Academy. That painter from the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets had probably used a similar method, but compared to Su Li, it was like the difference between the clouds and the mud. He also thought of that scholar he had seen on the side of the street, the Heavenly Tao Academy's Guanbai. At the time, he had glanced at this person through the window and felt a sharp, intense stab into his eyes. It was so painful that he almost shed tears. Now that he thought about it, this person's cultivation in the path of the sword was already so powerful that sword intent possessed his body. In next year's Boiling Stone Summit, he would have to face such a powerful sword. Would he be able to win? Even earlier, Guanbai had been reading in his study in the southern part of the city. Suddenly, he sensed something. After a moment of silence, he quietly closed the book and walked out of the study. In the evening, the snow gradually stopped, but the weather was still bitterly cold. The accumulated snow made it difficult to walk on the streets, so there were few pedestrians. He stood in the middle of the street. An old Taoist nun walked past him. In truth, this Taoist nun's appearance could still be considered young. At the very least, it was impossible to tell her exact age, but her face was filled with an awe-inspiring coldness and a sense of obsolescence. Guanbai silently watched as the old Taoist nun got closer and closer. He did not recognize her background, but he knew that her cultivation was far above his own, perhaps even surpassing his respected master, Zhuang Jihuan. Before the Boiling Stone Summit, he did not want a medal, nor should he have battled with an expert of such profound cultivation. But he had clearly heard that a wild dog had died in that distant alley, just as the old Taoist nun walked past. This old Taoist nun was very powerful and assuredly had an extraordinary background. Compared to her, the life of a wild dog blocking the road truly wasn't much. Guanbai also believed this. If a wild dog died, then it died. Was he going to take revenge for a wild dog? The problem was that the wild dog should have died even faster. The old Taoist nun only needed a glance for that wild dog's head to be separated from its body. But that wild dog had screamed 30-some times in the alley, growing more and more miserable, more and more sorrowful, until he could hear it. He found it impossible to understand why a powerful figure like the old Taoist nun would need 30-some strikes to kill a wild dog. He found it impossible to imagine if this old Taoist nun would also be like this when she normally killed people. So he walked out of the study onto the street, wanting to ask the old Taoist nun. The old Taoist nun stopped and expressionlessly gazed at him. Guanbai wanted to say something, but when he saw the old Taoist nun's eyes, he realized that he could no longer speak. His hand gripped the hilt of his sword, but he could not pull it out. The old Taoist nun's eyes were a green color, brimming with decay and ruthlessness. They were like a tide of green algae that surged toward him. Boundless green killing intent surged out from the snowy street and enveloped his body. Squelch! A stream of blood spurted from his mouth and fell onto the snow. He was the pride of the Heavenly Tao Academy, an expert of the sword ranked in the middle ranks of the Proclamation of Liberation. Great name Guanbai. Yet in front of this old Taoist nun, he was unable to utter a single word, unable to pull out his sword before he was heavily injured. "Report your master," the old Taoist nun expressionlessly said. Guanbai's eyes were filled with shock. Only now did he confirm that this old Taoist nun's strength not only far surpassed his teachers, but had even faintly transcended the realm of the mortal world and entered the divine domain. And when he thought of that green color in her eyes, he instantly guessed at who she was. Wu Qiongbai of the storms of the 8 directions. This was already the peak expert of the mortal world, so why had she suddenly appeared tonight in the capital? Heavenly Tao Academy's Guanbai. My master is Zhuang Jihuan. Because of the old Taoist nun's identity, Guanbai was incomparably shocked, but he still felt no fear as he stared at her. For the sake of Mao Qiuyu, I'll spare your life tonight. The old Taoist nun slowly walked past him, her figure gradually vanishing into the darkness. After some time, Guanbai finally realized that he could move. The right hand, gripping the hilt of his sword, slightly trembled, and with a clang, the edge of his sword half unsheathed. Then his right arm was severed at the shoulder and dropped into the snow, a vast expanse of dark red blood. Tonight, in the capital, a wild dog in an alley was cruelly chopped into pieces. The pride and hope of the Heavenly Tao Academy, the young expert of the sword with limitless prospects, Guanbai, had lost the right arm with which he gripped his sword. The old Taoist nun, who had done these 2 things, felt nothing. Her expression was still indifferent, her eyes still ruthless. In her eyes, a young man like Guanbai was not much different from a wild dog in an alley. If this were not the capital of the great Zhou, with the Pope whom even she had to respect, and the divine Empress whom she did not dare provoke, perhaps Guanbai would already be dead. In her view, sparing Guanbai's life was already giving Mao Qiuyu enough face. To be more precise, this face was giving the orthodoxy. There were some people in this world who were extremely strong, so their view of the world was somewhat distorted. They believed that by not stealing all the food in a beggar's bowl, they were giving the beggar face, and by not killing all the people they disliked, they were giving life face, so the other party should also give them face. The old Taoist nun had come to the capital tonight precisely because she believed that the Pope had not given her enough face, so she had come to personally retrieve it. When she was very young, she had been married to another of the storms of the 8 directions. From that moment on, she believed that her husband was her most important face. Later on, when she painstakingly gave birth to a son, she believed that her son was her most important face. The old Taoist nun stood behind the wall of the Orthodox Academy, expressionlessly gazing at the several snowy trees protruding from the wall. Several dozen days ago, Her son had suffered the humiliation of a person in this very place. That person was called Chun Changshin. The name of the chapter was better, so there was no need to use two. Today, there's only one chapter, so there's no two. Chapter 537. I have revised the last few sentences of the first chapter. It does not affect it. You can choose to read it or not. The next chapter will be at 8 in the evening. Su Li had left behind 7 letters. He had Su Yurong give 2 of the letters to Chun Changshin. 1 letter was left for his own daughter, and the other was left for the child in the smithy at the base of Mount Li who had just started learning the sword. He had also prepared a letter for Qiu Shanjun, but it had been calmly rejected by Qiu Shanjun. There were also 2 letters that had been sent through the most ordinary of postal routes to 2 different places. One of them had been sent to a manor outside Hanqiu City, the Myriad Willows Garden. Within the garden were 30,000 cold-resistant curved willows. Zhu Luo was the sect master of the emotion-severing sect, the head of the Zhu clan, an old friend of Emperor Xian, and a member of the Storms of the 8 Directions. Any one of these identities could allow him to live a life that ordinary people could not imagine. This manor that was still green, even in the cold of winter, was proof. Today, there was a guest in the manor. It was a very fat old man who sat on a round wooden armchair. His fat waist was like water flowing over a riverbank, and a lot of it flowed down. Thus, that bright yellow belt was also highlighted even more clearly. This fat old man had a kind and benevolent countenance, his squinted eyes filled with a calm and gentleness that stood aloof from worldly affairs. His face was filled with joy, and he looked just like the most ordinary of wealthy people in the countryside. However, for him to be able to sit across from an important figure like Zhu Luo, one could imagine that his identity was certainly not ordinary. Today, other than the 10,000 willows and the accumulated snow, there was not a single person in the manor. Perhaps it had something to do with this fat old man's visit, but of course, it also had something to do with the letter placed on the table between the two. When will that woman die? The fat old man smiled as he spoke, but when he said the word woman, he unexpectedly paused, the smile on his face vanishing for a moment. The word woman was so soft that it was almost inaudible. The starry sky has its own arrangements. As for when to go to the capital, we'll have to wait for news. Zhu Luo slightly creased his brow, seemingly not very satisfied with these words. No matter how you look at it, my strength is still somewhat lacking. The fat old man sighed. To accomplish great things, one must have mighty strength. The White Emperor couple will definitely watch from the sidelines. In truth, our best choice is still Su Li. When Su Li's name was mentioned, neither he nor Zhu Luo glanced at the letter on the table. After a moment of silence, Zhu Luo said, Su Li truly is very strong. At the time, in Xuanyang City, Su Li had been heavily injured and had not exchanged blows with him, but he had to admit that purely in terms of strength, it was difficult to find someone in the world stronger than Su Li. The word power in this conversation naturally did not refer to ordinary power as understood by ordinary people. It referred to the purest and most terrifying combat strength. Black Robe has been preparing for many years. On the snowy plains of the Demon Realm, there were more than 100,000 cavalry and wolf cavalry, more than 10 demon generals, and 3 powerhouses working together to suppress him, but he still managed to escape. After that, he went all the way back to the south, using a useless person to wash his sword and become a new person. He must have comprehended something and reached the peak of 10,000 zhang. I'm afraid he's 1 foot closer to the Sea of Stars. He's indeed extremely strong. The fat old man sighed and said, back then, many people, including me, thought that he was the only one who had the best chance to kill that woman, but he refused to do it. Now, with his help, the possibility of killing that woman will increase by 30%, but he just had to leave at this time. Zhu Luo expressionlessly replied, I accepted His Holiness the Pope's request and went to Xuanyang City to kill him. How could he join us? And how could he send me this letter? As the two spoke, they did not even glance at the letter on the table. Their minds had actually always been on this letter. Now that it was mentioned, their gazes finally fell. No strange changes occurred in the quiet and secluded winter garden, but in the chilly wind, one could faintly hear the clattering of spears and armored horses. As he gazed at the letter, the fat old man narrowed his eyes like a snow-white steamed bun that had been cut into a slit by a knife. Within the slit was a scorching light, making him abnormally vigilant. Then he raised his head to look at Zhu Luo, as if asking, should he open this letter or not? Zhu Luo's expression was very solemn. For a very long time, he did not speak. The fat old man could sense the strangeness of this letter, and with his level of cultivation, he could naturally see through it as well. He knew that this letter concealed a sword. The letter was Su Li's letter, and the sword was naturally Su Li's sword. Although Su Li had an extremely high status in the cultivation world and was publicly acknowledged to be inconceivably strong in the path of the sword, compared to the storms of the 8 directions and the 4 saints, he was still a junior. Moreover, for various reasons, his name had never been placed in this list. He had written this letter to Zhu Luo to tell the entire continent that as long as he wanted to, he could cut down the so-called storms of the 8 directions at any time. If this were several hundred years ago, when he was at his peak, no, even several decades ago, or even a year ago, faced with this letter, Zhu Luo would have smiled without the slightest care, and then opened the letter to take a look at the edge of the paper. Only by doing so would he not disgrace the prestige of the storms of the 8 directions. But now he was somewhat hesitant, because he had suffered very heavy injuries in Xuanyang City. Even now, he had still not completely recovered. Those injuries had come from Wang Po's blade, Lu Qing's hidden sword, and the 10,000 streams of light in Chen Chongqing's sheath. The most serious injury had come from the Holy Maiden's 1,000-li dash. An even more important reason was that, just as Wang Po had said in Xuanyang City, he was already old. Su Li had once mocked and mentioned that the current him could die, but he could not be defeated. He was the towering tree of the emotion-severing sect and the Zhu clan. Other than the people of the Liang household, all the people of Tianliang County needed his protection. What if he lost? The winter courtyard was extremely quiet. In the distance, the tens of thousands of cold-resistant willows patiently waited in the cold wind for the arrival of spring. The plump old man was also very patient. He only calmly gazed at Zhu Luo. After some time, Zhu Luo finally made his decision and took in a deep breath. A fierce gale suddenly arose in the winter courtyard. The tens of thousands of willows swayed in the wind, seeming to be cheering, but also seeming to be waving their hands in fear. Not a hint of hesitation could be seen on Zhu Luo's face, only indifference and cold arrogance. He was the strongest human expert who had once charged through the snowy plains with only his sword. Even with his old injuries, how could he be frightened by a letter? His hand fell on the letter very steadily, and then he tore it open. A sword glow shot out from the tear in the letter, illuminating his face and making it seem very pale. This sword glow was so bright that even the winter sun above the winter courtyard seemed to dim. Smoke rose from the willows. It was clearly daytime, but it seemed like dusk had descended. A sword glow appeared in Zhu Luo's eyes. This sword glow did not come from the letter, but from his world. With a clang, the moonlight sword left its sheath and slashed at the sword intent bursting from the letter. Countless deafening collisions could be heard. A fierce gale blew through the myriad willows garden, causing the tens of thousands of willows to sway unsteadily. A bright moon came from the north, hanging in the sky of the winter courtyard, as if it wanted to drive away the darkness that had yet to arrive. The sword intent from the letter completely ignored this. In an instant, it exploded with light. Everything it touched, whether real or illusory, began to burn. The willows suddenly burst into flames. The frozen pond shattered, and countless flames soared into the sky like birds of fire. The golden crow left Mount Li. The bright moon suddenly dimmed. Chapter 538. When Zhu Luo opened Su Li's letter, the chubby old man sat on the side with a smile, not at all worried. He naturally knew that Su Li was very strong, that Su Li's sword was very terrifying, but this was still just a letter. Even if it contained Su Li's sword intent and soul, the medium was limited. So how could it truly injure Zhu Luo? The chubby old man even felt some disdain for Zhu Luo's hesitation. He thought to himself, perhaps the matter of the capital requires other arrangements. But when that sword intent broke out of the letter and plunged the entire Myriad Willows garden into darkness, the chubby old man realized that he was wrong. Su Li's sword was even more powerful and terrifying than he imagined. Just by relying on the sword intent on the letter, it was actually able to suppress a supreme expert on the level of the storms of the 8 directions. Although Zhu Luo was injured, this was still too inconceivable. The level of that sword intent had even faintly surpassed Zhu Luo by a level. Even the will of a sage might not be able to achieve this. Besides legendary experts like Zhou Dufu, Chen Xuanba, Emperor Taizong, or Wang Jitze, who could do this? Su Li was not a saint, but his path of the sword was close to that of a god. Seeing the golden crows spurting out of the winter garden and the sudden dimming of the bright moon in the night sky, the chubby old man revealed a shocked expression. Without any time to think, he floated over. Zhu Luo was already in danger. If he did not act now, it would be too late. With a howl, the chubby old man's 2 palms tore through the air in front of him and slapped at the blazing sword intents like the golden crows. He looked like a mountain of flesh, but his movements were very gentle. His 2 palms descended similarly gently, slowly flapping, just like a real bird. The golden crow sword was a secret sword of Mount Li, originating from Su Li. Its sword intent was incomparably blazing. Once the sword rose up, it would endlessly spit out light and heat into the outside world with unstoppable momentum. Back in the Grand Examination and the Garden of Zhou, Chen Changsheng had used the Golden Crow sword several times, and even opponents stronger than him had to temporarily avoid its edge. Today's Golden Crow sword intents came from Su Li's hands, so their power was even more unimaginable. If it were a normal cultivator, they would probably be melted into smoke before they could even touch the sword intents. Even experts of extremely profound cultivation could only do what Zhu Luo did, relying on the moonlight sword intent to contend against it. They did not dare to directly touch it. For some reason, although the plump old man had a wary expression on his face, he still swatted at the Golden Crow sword intent. An indescribable aura appeared in the ruined courtyard of Myriad Willow's garden. That aura was very strong, but it was actually not as strong as Zhu Luo's moonlight sword intent. However, that aura gave off a very ancient feeling. A real sun appeared in the middle of the fat old man's palm. It was extremely bright and dazzling. Under the illumination of the light, the chubby old man's face no longer showed any signs of joy. His benevolent countenance became incomparably dignified, and the image of a dragon and tiger appeared behind him. At this moment, he was no longer a common rich man in the countryside. He was clearly an emperor. 3 powerful auras met in the Myriad Willows garden. The moonlight shone in the sky with difficulty. The scorching sun kept pushing down the curtain of night. Countless sword wills flew between the sky and the sun like firebirds. Tens of thousands of cold-resistant willows began to burn. This was not a flame brought by the twilight, but a real burning. The cold winter garden seemed to have instantly fallen into the scorching abyss of hell. With a massive boom, sparks flew everywhere, scorched willows toppled, wells shattered, and walls collapsed. After some time, those berserk chis finally began to subside. The courtyard was in ruins, and the cold pool could no longer illuminate anyone. Zhu Luo leaned against a withered willow by the pool, his face pale and his chest stained with blood. Even more serious was that his left hand had been severed at the wrist. The fat old man stood on a tattered table, his fat body squeezing the edge of the table so tightly that it seemed like it might break at any moment. His fat face no longer showed any signs of joy, nor did it have the majesty of an emperor. All that was left was exhaustion and unsightly appearance. Starting many years ago, he had already seen the threshold of the divine domain. If not for his fear of that person in the capital, perhaps he would have already stepped over it. and in the previous battle, he had even displayed a strength not inferior to that of the divine domain. But he and Zhu Luo had still lost, and had lost so miserably. If not for the fact that the target of that sword intent had been Zhu Luo, if not for the fact that his clan's technique was similar to the Tao of the Golden Crow sword, he would have definitely been heavily injured. And even with his help, Zhu Luo might already be dead. And their opponent was just a letter from Su Li. Zhu Luo slowly stood up and gazed at the surrounding plains. The myriad willows garden that used to be infinitely beautiful was now a scorched earth. In the distance, some willows were still burning. The myriad willows garden still existed, but it no longer had its name. Just like him now, he was keenly aware that this was Su Li's vengeance. He had nothing to say to this. Forgive me for not being able to participate in the matter of the capital, Zhu Luo said to the fat old man. He did not turn around, his expression rather lonely. The fat old man knew that this was inevitable, let alone the fact that Zhu Luo might never be able to recover his peak strength. There was even a high chance that he would leave the ranks of the storms of the Eight Directions. To Zhu Luo, how to arrange the future of his clan and the emotion-severing sect was the most important matter, because that was his true funeral business. The fat old man swayed his mountainous body as he walked out of the myriad willows garden. Outside Hanqiu City, with the assistance of his subordinates, he somewhat arduously climbed onto a massive carriage. A middle-aged man with a face covered in powder and a rather shrill voice whispered, "Your Highness, what happened? Did you know? I originally thought that if I succeeded, the first thing I would do would be to seize the Liang household's imperial carriage." The fat old man narrowed his eyes and gazed in the direction of Xuanyang City. He sadly said, "But now I don't know if I'll ever have the chance to sit on it." He was gazing at Xuanyang City, but in reality, he was gazing at the capital. He was speaking of the Liang household's imperial carriage, but in reality, he was referring to the throne in the imperial palace. The middle-aged man had already been extremely uneasy from the strange change that had occurred in the myriad willows garden, and now that he heard the sigh of the prince, he felt even more uneasy. He and those soldiers and civil officials were all subordinates of the prince's household, but they could only listen to the orders of the capital. In these past few years, he and his subordinates had braved enormous risks to help the prince run about. If the prince failed in his great undertaking, how could they possibly survive? Wu Qiongbai has entered the capital. The middle-aged man wanted to reinvigorate the prince's confidence, so he hurriedly relayed the news he had just received. The fat old man was somewhat surprised. Although Wu Qiongbai was also a storm of the Eight Directions, she had never been one of his recruitment targets, because she was also a woman. What was that old Taoist nun doing in the capital? Could there be some sort of variable? Chapter 539. Su Li had sent a letter to Hanqiu City, turning the myriad willows garden into scorched earth, and Zhu Luo was no more. For the time being, this matter had not spread throughout the continent. At the moment, the continent was mostly discussing what sort of changes Su Li and the Holy Maiden would bring to the world after they left together. The happiest was naturally the Longevity sect. The Longevity sect was known as the source of all mountains, standing side by side with Holy Maiden Peak. They were both holy lands in the hearts of the Southerners, and they had an extremely close relationship with the Great Zhou imperial clan and the Liang household. They also had countless connections with the great clans of the South that were difficult to sever. They were powerful to an unimaginable degree, until that startling change 10-some years ago, when the Longevity sect imprisoned the demon princess in a cold pool and attempted to coerce Su Li into going north to the capital to assassinate the Tianhai divine empress. Su Li charged into the mountain alone, and when he discovered that his wife was deeply poisoned and was powerless to reverse the situation, in a fit of rage, he slaughtered 10-some elders of the Longevity sect and then massacred the Longevity sect. After he recovered from his heavy injuries, he went north to Xuanyang City and slaughtered everyone in the Liang household. At least half of Su Li's peerless and vicious reputation came from this. From then on, no one dared to casually provoke Su Li. At the same time, the Longevity sect no longer had its former prestige. Many sects and monasteries gradually turned their backs on the sect, and places like the Mountly Sword sect only had respect on the surface. In reality, they had long since taken matters into their own hands. In the view of the longevity sect, Su Li was naturally the main culprit behind all this. If they could kill Su Li, they would have done so long ago. Although they could not do it, fortunately, Su Li had left. In the last few days, although the longevity sect had no lanterns, the atmosphere was extremely good. The footsteps of the disciples seemed to have become much more relaxed. As for those elders that had struggled at death's door, they even began to celebrate ahead of time and yearn for the beautiful life ahead of them. The Mountly Sword sect is the sword of my longevity sect, so it naturally has to be held in our hands. During the internal strife of Mountly, the Qiushan clan head had suddenly turned against them. The longevity sect's elder Liang that he had invited had been injured and was still recuperating. As a result, the cave he resided in became the place where the longevity sect elders discussed business. One of the elders, a tall and thin elder, indifferently but with an incomparably firm expression, said a few words. Elder Liang thought back to the 10,000 sword glows from Mount Li and slightly creased his brow. Just how difficult it is to repeat the past. Hearing this, the cave abode fell silent. In the past, with the exception of Holy Maiden Peak, which sect in the entire Tian Nan dared to disobey a single order from the longevity sect? What about all these years? Let alone the Mountly Sword sect, even the Qiushan clan dared to secretly attack the longevity sect? Our sect's chi and blood have been consumed, so how good can Mountly be? After the matter with Elder Xiao Songgong, Mountly has already suffered a great blow to its vitality. Those fellows of the same generation as us, or those of the younger generation, especially those people in the training hall, have all suffered a backlash from the array. Their injuries are not light, so they probably won't be able to come out and oversee matters for a while. Don't forget, right now, the one managing Mount Li's affairs is Qiushan. Qiushan, a young genius. He's indeed extraordinary, but he's still young, isn't he? The tall and thin elder said with an indifferent expression, not only Mount Li, but also South Stream Temple. The current Holy Maiden is also very young. It's true that she has enough prestige, but she's only 16 and hasn't even reached star condensation. As elders of the same sect, it's only right and proper for us to help her handle some affairs. This is the concern of the younger generation. Hearing this, Elder Liang fell silent, while the other elder revealed a joyful expression. Elder Liang sighed, then said, "But have you ever thought about what to do if Su Li returns?" After a moment of silence in the dwelling, the tall and thin elder sneered. With Su Li's pride, since he announced to the entire world that he was leaving, how could he possibly go somewhere else? Just as we guessed a few days ago, he and the Holy Maiden should be preparing to go to the legendary shore on the other side of the Sea of Stars. So how will he return? Elder Liang looked at him and said sincerely, "But what if the legend is true? If he really does find the sacred light continent, then there will still be a day when he returns." A hint of fear flashed through the tall and thin elder's eyes, but he still unyieldingly said, "It's rumored that Zhou Dufu finally shattered the void and left. He probably also wanted to go there, but not even he was able to find it. At least he was unable to return. No matter how strong Su Li is, could he be stronger than him?" The other elder also advised, "Senior brother, there's no need to worry too much. Su Li probably won't be able to return." In the midst of winter, the longevity sect in the south was still warm. There was no snow on the mountains, only the incessant drizzle, as if it was sending him off in joy. Su Li had left, and it was unknown if he would ever return, or when he would return, but his letter had arrived. Looking at the thin letter on the table, no one spoke for a very long time, nor did they make any movements. The three people at the table had abnormally nasty complexions, as if they had seen a demon from the deepest depths of the abyss. The three remaining elders of the longevity sect seemed to have been scared out of their wits by this letter. The dwelling was deathly still. There was no sound at all, only the dripping of water from the ivy in the depths. Hearing the dripping of water, the tall and thin elder's complexion was abnormally ashen, and he was extremely vexed. Elder Liang's complexion was pale, his lips slightly parted, but he could not speak. There was no inscription on the letter, not even the slightest handwriting, but when their gazes fell on the letter, they could feel that sharp and frightening sword intent, stabbing them with incomparable pain. This letter contained sword intent, Su Li's sword intent. After some time, the deathly stillness in the dwelling was finally broken. The tall and thin elder yelled, "Just what does he want to do? He wants to scare us to death with a single letter?" As he said this, his chest heaved up and down, like a southern bamboo that had been roasted over a fire, ready to explode at any moment. He was truly furious, so angry that his lungs were about to explode. Yet his voice was somewhat hoarse from nervousness. He was forced to admit that even though Su Li had already left on a long journey, the letter he had left behind was still enough to intimidate the longevity sect. In truth, this was the true reason for his anger. Another elder turned to Elder Liang and uneasily asked, "Senior brother, what do we do? Should we open it?" A burst of dry laughter suddenly resounded through the dwelling. Elder Liang gazed at the letter, and his pale face suddenly gained a tinge of blood. He gazed at the green mountains, the sea of clouds, and the winter rain outside the dwelling, a hint of madness in his eyes. He harshly yelled at Su Li, "You sent this letter just to wait for us to open it and fight with the sword intent you left behind. Do you think we're stupid?" The elder had asked him if he wanted to open the letter. To him, who had lived in Su Li's shadow for 10-some years, this was no problem at all. This letter naturally could not be opened, because he did not want to die. Send someone to deliver this letter to the bottom of the mountain stream, and use an array to carefully suppress it. Elder Liang slightly narrowed his eyes and sneered, "I'd like to see just how long Su Li's sword intent can last under the golden light array." The tall and thin elder nodded at these words, but soon after, he thought of another important matter. Creasing his brow, he asked, "But it won't affect Chusu, right?" Upon hearing the name Chusu, the elder's expression instantly became nervous. The next chapter should be at 9 o'clock in the evening. Chapter 540. With the golden light array protecting his Tao heart, no external demons can affect Chusu's cultivation. Elder Liang continued, "On the contrary, I want to borrow the array to suppress Su Li's sword intent, and then use 10,000 mountains to grind it down so that Chusu can comprehend it." Hearing this, the two elders relaxed. They thought, if they really can shatter Su Li's sword intent and send it to Chusu, then perhaps Chusu really will come into the world many years earlier than the sect master had calculated before his death. At that time, the longevity sect will truly be able to flourish once more. Just as the three of them were fantasizing about the beautiful future, a sudden change occurred. The letter on the table began to fiercely tremble. With a ripping sound, the letter split open, transforming into countless paper butterflies that scattered in all directions. How could Su Li's letter need to be opened to be seen? How could the sword intent he had left behind be like those magical artifacts that needed to be activated? He wanted the people of the longevity sect to see his letter, his sword. Then, whether or not anyone opened the letter, they would definitely see it. An extremely overbearing and swift sword insight soared into the sky and slashed down. The cave resounded with the shrill cry of a sword, so much so that the similarly shrill screams were drowned out. The fierce sword intent severed everything it encountered. The swords of the three elders of profound cultivation. The longevity sect's 10,000-year indestructible cave. The soft ivy in the depths of the cave. The transparent water dripping from the ivy. The invisible wind formed by the flowing air. Everything was destroyed by this sword intent in an instant. The air was filled with bloody mist. It seemed abnormally bloody, but also possessed a soul-stirring beauty. The three swords had been broken into 10-odd pieces. Dozens of sword marks appeared on Elder Liang's body as he collapsed amidst the ruins on the ground. Looking at the sword intent that was rushing out of the abode, His pale face was filled with endless fear and regret. He, who was already on the verge of death, used the last of his strength to scream, "Quickly, close the formation." The two elders heard his words and realized where the problem lay. Despair appeared in their eyes, but they could not stop the sword intent from flying through the air. Because their arms had already been severed by that strand of sword insight, their entire bodies were covered in blood, and they were already unable to stand up. The sword intent transformed into a beautiful stream of light and flew down from the cliff peak. It passed over the longevity sect and pierced through the clouds, flying into a mountain stream shrouded in mist. An extremely terrifying boom erupted between heaven and earth, and a circle of clear light enveloped over a dozen mountain peaks within a radius of several hundred kilometers. It was the longevity sect's grand sect-protecting formation. Then, the sound of metal rubbing against each other rang out from the mountain stream. Countless beams of golden light shot out, and the sea of clouds rolled restlessly. A tender but resentful voice rang out from the deep ravine. It sounded like a human voice, but it also sounded like the song of a bird or some mechanical repetition. "Chusu, Chusu." The sword whistled sharply. The voice gradually faded away and could no longer be heard. It was already late at night, but many people were still awake. Some people were awake because they loved someone, some because they hated someone, some because they missed someone, and some because they missed delicious food. Before going to sleep, Xinyuan ate half a Tangjing roast goose for his supper, but he didn't stay in bed for long before he was hungry again. How could he sleep when he was hungry? He walked to the kitchen on the other side of the lake, intending to take out the crab sauce he had made a few days ago and eat it. Walking into the kitchen, he realized that the fire under the stove had apparently been extinguished. He paid it no mind, nor did he light a lamp. In the darkness, he very accurately felt his way to the pickle jars. In those seemingly unremarkable pickle jars, there was actually no ordinary crab sauce. He had used the incomparably valuable blue lobster to replace the crab, so it was probably lobster sauce. He was currently the logistics manager of the Orthodox Academy and had an extremely good relationship with the chefs of Clear Lake Restaurant, so he naturally did not lack for food. However, eating so extravagantly was somewhat of a waste. If Chun, Changsheng, and Tang 36 were to find out, they would assuredly have a massive reaction. Thus, he did not let anyone know about these jars of lobster sauce and secretly hid them away. The more you secretly hid the food, the more fragrant it was. Xinyuan did not understand many of the principles and rules of the human world, but he was very clear on this point. In the process of extending his hand towards the pickle jars, it was as if he had already tasted the extreme saltiness and freshness of the lobster sauce and the rich sweetness within, as well as that wonderful texture that spread all over the surface of his tongue. Yet his hand touched empty air. The pickle jars that should have been there had disappeared. All of them had disappeared. The lobster sauce in the pickle jars was naturally gone as well. Xinyuan became abnormally angry. Several thin bolts of lightning formed in his eyes, and crackling sounds could faintly be heard from his slightly curled and messy hair. The world in front of his eyes turned from darkness to light, allowing him to clearly see the scene in the kitchen. Not only the pickle jars, the iron pot, the bowls and chopsticks, the pile of firewood, and even the stove had already been reduced to pieces, piled up on the ground. The ground was a mess. The soup on the ground was incomparably filthy. Xinyuan became even angrier and more vigilant. What had happened here? Who had unleashed such a terrifying sword intent here? The entire room was filled with objects that had been chopped into pieces by the sword intent. Only the mountain sea sword was still there, quietly lying in the wood shavings. Xinyuan extended his hand to pick up the mountain sea sword and followed the thin remnants of the sword intent. He discovered that in the ashes of the stove, there was ash of a different color. The ash did not seem like it was made from firewood, but more like it was made from paper. After a moment of hesitation, he used the mountain sea sword to lightly pluck at the ash. The ash immediately dispersed. An unimaginable chill suddenly enveloped the entire room. Xinyuan Po's body became abnormally stiff, and his breathing became heavy. An unimaginable feeling of danger arose in his heart. The chill and feeling of danger had nothing to do with the slowly dispersing ash. Instead, it came from behind him, from behind the academy wall. It was the deepest ocean floor, with a suffocating pressure and cold. The boundless blue waves had always been an ocean of death. Xin Yuan Po began to sweat, but before his sweat could even wet his clothes, it was frozen in a frost by the chill that represented death. Gazing at the Orthodox Academy in the darkness, the old Taoist nun walked forward. A streak of frost appeared on the academy wall, then noiselessly softened, becoming sand in the wind. This scene was like a legend. The academy wall collapsed, and what appeared in front of her was the kitchen. Thus, the kitchen also noiselessly collapsed. Xin Yuan beheld the mountain sea sword and stood in the ruins, his body incessantly trembling, because he was very afraid. Although he was very brave, he was still very afraid. The newcomer was unimaginably strong. His chi was very cold, giving off a feeling that he wanted to exterminate all living things. In a small building on the other side of the winter lake, Zhishou opened his eyes. Chen Changsheng opened his eyes. They had all felt this feeling and then felt an indescribable fear. The title of the chapter was randomly chosen. I've run out of words. It's also the sentence pattern I used many years ago when I was writing Vermilion Bird and The Spy when I was bored. Chapter 541. The courtyard wall noiselessly collapsed, and the old Taoist nun walked in through the gap. With her step, an incomparably powerful chi, like an ocean, instantly enveloped the entire Orthodox Academy. The students in the dormitory were still sleeping, and the Orthodoxy cavalry in the side courtyard did not sense it. Chen Changsheng and the others in the house immediately sensed it, because the old Taoist nun wanted them to wake up and remember what had happened next. They opened their eyes and sensed that cold aura of silent extinction. It was like they had fallen into a frigid ice house, and their sleepiness instantly vanished. The windows of the small building were pushed open one by one, revealing the faces of those young people. They saw the old Taoist nun on the other side of the lake. The moment they saw the old Taoist nun, the aura of silent extinction transformed into the aura of death and boundless fear. The old Taoist nun was too powerful, so powerful that they found it very difficult to even think of resisting. Seeing the old Taoist nun, Tang 36 recalled how his grandfather had once lost his temper and caused all of Wenshui city to tremble. Zhishou recalled how, not long after he had been driven out of the tribe, he had once seen that massive mountain-toppling fiend from afar, as well as that short yet incomparably terrifying figure sitting on its head. Su Moyu's complexion became abnormally pale because he knew who the old Taoist nun was. At this moment, Chen Changsheng very naturally recalled the storm in Xuanyang City, and only then did he realize with shock that this old Taoist nun was actually an expert of this level. Logically speaking, with Chen Changsheng's current status, no one would dare to move against him in the capital. But he did not have this confidence now, because this old Taoist nun was no ordinary person. Even the Pope had to give her some face, and she currently gave off an extreme aura of extinction. The extinction of birds on 1,000 mountains, the extinction of people on 10,000 paths. She viewed all living beings of the world as pigs and dogs. Who did she not dare to kill? Just then, Su Moyu's voice rang out. He looked at the old Taoist nun and asked in shock, "Aunt, what do you want to do?" Upon hearing this, Chen Changsheng and the others finally confirmed their conjectures and knew the identity of the newcomer. Tang 36's expression did not change, but the fingers of his fingers resting on the windowsill were somewhat white. Zhishou's expression did not change, but the fingers of his right hand had already slowly loosened their grip on the cane and gripped the hilt of his sword. She had finally arrived. The peerless expert who was known for doting on her only son, shielding him, being irritable, murderous, and temperamental, had finally arrived. Wu Qiongbai, the only woman of the storms of the 8 directions. Her husband was called Bi Yanghong, also one of the storms of the 8 directions. They had an only son called Bi Tianxin. The only children of two wind and rain empress. One could imagine how they grew up. Bi Tianxin's life had been smooth sailing until several weeks ago, when he encountered Chen Chongqing and Tang 36 at the gate of the Orthodox Academy. At the time, Sun Weiyu had warned them that the Orthodox Academy might encounter some sort of trouble. Chen Chongqing, on the other hand, was thinking that the Orthodox Academy had not done anything excessive to Bi Tianxin. With Wu Qiangbai's status and seniority, there was no need for her to make things difficult for him. Only now, when he saw the old Taoist nun on the other side of the lake, did he realize that not all masters were otherworldly masters with a transcendent mental state. Senior, entering the Tradition Academy at night, what can I do for you? He looked at the old Taoist nun and asked with a steady voice. He was the principal of the Orthodox Academy, the Pope's appointed successor. Purely in terms of status, he was not below her, so he said these words very calmly. The old Taoist nun indifferently asked, "You're Chen Chongqing?" Ever since he left Xining and came to the capital, Chen Chongqing had heard this question countless times. Sometimes, it was very annoying, like when he encountered that monolith guardian in the Mausoleum of Books. Sometimes, it was an honor, like when he encountered Zhu Luo outside Hanqiu City. The old Taoist nun asking this question had a status similar to Zhu Luo's on the continent, but he knew that this was not honor, but danger. The old Taoist nun had an indifferent expression, her life and death already decided. In a little while, I will kill this person. As she said this, she looked at Chen Chongqing and pointed at Xin Yuan Po's back. Xin Yuan Po's body slightly trembled. Under this incomparably terrifying pressure, he simply could not turn around, nor could he leave. I will also do a few things for all of you to see. The old Taoist nun did not even glance at Xin Yuan Po or the ruins in front of her. In her eyes, Xin Yuan Po was already a dead man. Tonight, she had already made arrangements for the youths of the Orthodox Academy, had decided their lives. The divine general of the great Zhou army greatly admired Zhishio, so that Wolf Cub would only be heavily injured, with a broken arm or a broken leg. She would not kill Chen Chongqing and Tang 36, because even someone as powerful as she did not want to offend the orthodoxy or the Wenshui Tangs. But this did not mean that she would let them go. She would cripple Zhishio in front of their eyes, then slowly kill that Yao youth. She wanted them to watch as their friend's blood splattered on the spot, powerless to reverse the situation. She wanted them to understand what true helplessness, true despair was. She believed that after the fact, they would suffer even more if they were still alive than if they were already dead. This was very good. She had originally come to educate them, so she wanted to leave them with an unforgettable memory. As for whether the youths of the Orthodox Academy would resist, she had never considered this question. Everyone said that these youths were true geniuses, but so what? Let alone the proclamation of Azure Sky or the proclamation of Golden Distinction. If they were juniors like Wang Per or Xiao Zhang, or perhaps she would take a second look, what did these youths amount to? Yes, if it were any other youth, upon sensing such a terrifying and powerful qi, especially after guessing the old Taoist nun's identity, perhaps they would give up resisting, because they were no match for her. If they were young eagles, the old Taoist nun would be the cold, high altitude. If they were young tigers, the old Taoist nun would be the bottomless abyss. But they were not other youths, they were the youths of the Orthodox Academy. In Xuanyang City, Chen Chongqing dared to attack Zhu Luo. On the snowy plains, Zhishio dared to bare his fangs of the demons. At the age of 3, Tang Tang dared to pee on the Tang old master's face. When they first entered the capital, Xin Yuanpa dared to fight with Tian Haiyuer. In any case, they couldn't beat him, so they didn't fight? This was not their logic. In their view, since they couldn't beat him no matter what, they had to fight first. They couldn't beat him? So what if they couldn't beat him? If they would die, then they would seek life in death. The youths began to prepare for battle, each with their own style of battle. The walking stick lay in the shadow of the ground. Zheshio stood in the shadow of the window, his face covered in shadow, covering his blood-red eyes, his tough wolf fur, his sharp wolf claws. He calmly stared at the old Taoist nun, his right hand gripping the half-broken demon commander's banner sword, his calm and indifference causing one's heart to palpitate. Tang 36 exerted a little force with his palms, shattering the windowsill. With several strange sounds, several fireworks flew into the drifting snowy night sky. As it turned out, he had been setting up traps in the Orthodox Academy this entire time. This was his style of battle. When encountering such a terrifying enemy, he naturally had to send out a warning smoke signal at the first possible moment. The closest place was the Imperial Palace, so Xue Xingchuan would probably arrive very quickly. As for the experts that the Shui Tangs had sent to protect him in secret, they would be the first to appear. Of course, even if the second-ranked divine General Xue Xingchuan and the guardians of the Shui Tangs worked together, they still wouldn't be a match for this old Taoist nun. But he didn't believe that this old Taoist nun would actually dare to kill them in front of everyone. Su Moyu's face was pale. Looking at the old Taoist nun, he said in a trembling voice, "Aunt, do you really want the two families to become enemies?" Chen Changsheng looked at the old Taoist nun. He did not intend to use the 10,000 swords in his sheath or the heavenly tome monoliths, but instead gripped a letter. He knew that no matter how much he risked his life, he would still be no match for a single finger of the old Taoist nun. He could only hope that Su Li's letter would be of some use. With several extremely soft noises of annihilation, the warning fireworks that flew into the night sky did not even have the time to release their light before vanishing. Tang 36's complexion was rather unsightly. This was the first time he had encountered an expert of this level. Only now did he realize that the calculations and deductions he was familiar with regarding battle and the human heart were meaningless in front of these people. These people had already transcended the secular world. So how could they be trapped by the wisdom of the secular world? Chen Changsheng tightly gripped the letter in his hand, his heart sinking. Just at this moment, the seemingly forgotten Xianyuan Pa, already a dead man in the old Taoist nun's eyes, suddenly moved. With extreme difficulty, he slowly turned around in the ruins, then slowly raised the metal sword in his hand. He was the closest to the academy wall, the closest to the old Taoist nun, so he could feel the chi of extinction even more clearly and bear the greatest pressure. When Chen Changsheng, Zhixiu, and the others had finished their preparations for battle, he was still resisting that pressure. Finally, he turned around and raised his sword. To confront a terrifying expert like the old Taoist nun, to overcome his natural fear of death, Xianyuan Pa had used up all his courage. Just this simple action had used up all his strength and spirit. Facing the old Taoist nun, his body incessantly trembled, as if he had just recovered from a serious illness. The metal sword in his hand was the same, tottering on the verge of collapse. He had already displayed sufficient courage, but how could he fight in this state? How could he strike? For the first time, the old Taoist nun looked straight at Xianyuan Pa. Her eyes were filled with endless mockery and contempt. Logically speaking, peerless experts on the level of the storms of the eight directions would not humiliate a junior like this. But today, she had come to humiliate the Orthodox Academy. Xianyuan Pa was a youth of the Bear tribe. He valued bravery and glory above all else. He could not endure humiliation. His face was flushed red. His somewhat immature features revealed a hint of determination. With a loud roar, he gripped the metal sword with both hands and slashed at the old Taoist nun. Several swift and fierce gusts of wind could be heard from the little tower. Zhixiu, like a gray shadow, instantly passed through the frozen lake of winter and arrived at this location. Chen Changsheng's figure suddenly blurred. Using the discerning step, he brought along the bits of snow in the forest and rushed to Xianyuan Pa's back. His hands tightened, preparing to rip open the letter. Su Moyu's face revealed a look of determination, his hands reaching into his bosom. Tang 36 and the others were the last, their voices first. Wuqiang Baiyu asterisk 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 asterisk. The next chapter was still 8 o'clock p.m. Chapter 542. Normally, no matter how arrogant Tang 36 was, He wouldn't have cursed the old Taoist nun like this, because the old Taoist nun status was far too high. Even the old master of the Tang family might not have much respect for her, but he would at least be wary of her. But at this moment, he unhesitatingly cursed her, because he wanted to provoke the old Taoist nun and distract her attention, because he was so angry and afraid that he forgot to be afraid, and because Xian Yuan unexpectedly raised the sword in his hand. The Bear Tribe youth that was so energetic that he ate 6 meals a day and smashed trees every day had his own fighting style. His bravery was the best in Orthodox Academy. His fighting style was different from Chun Chongsheng's group. He didn't think, after being humiliated, he would fight to get rid of it, even if he had to pay with his life. But how could his sword hit the old Taoist nun? How could he win against the old Taoist nun? Based on the standards of the human cultivation world, Xian Yuan was already at ethereal opening, but he couldn't possibly hurt the old Taoist nun. The heavy sword was like a weak willow branch, locked in the cold wind by the lake, unable to descend. The old Taoist nun looked at the sword and seemed to recognize its origin. She raised her eyebrows in surprise, but she wasn't going to be merciful. That cold aura of death instantly took control of his body and sea of consciousness. In the next moment, it would tear him to pieces like a raging wave. With a single thought, Xian Yuan would die. Chun Chongsheng, Zhixiu, Su Mou, and Tang 36 were like 4 arrows shooting towards the lake. But even if they sacrificed their lives, they couldn't change the result. They could only watch as Xian Yuan died in front of their eyes. Was there anyone who could change all this? Perhaps. Chun Chongsheng still had a last resort. He prepared to throw out that life-saving item without hesitation. Su Mo was also preparing. Tang 36 was also preparing. They were all prepared to take out their trump cards, hoping that it would give Xian Yuan a chance to survive. But at this moment, an unexpected change occurred. The sword in Xian Yuan's hand was trapped in the cold wind, unable to advance an inch, but it still brought with it some wind, even if it was the softest of breezes. The gentle breeze was unable to break the stillness of the lake, unable to ruffle the strands of the horsetail whisk at the old Taoist nun's waist. It could not even move the snow, but it could move the smoke and dust. Xian Yuan stood in the ruins. His feet landed on what used to be a stove, and ashes from the stove were scattered everywhere. The ashes were the embers of the firewood, and some were the ashes of a piece of paper. Previously, Xian Yuan had used his iron sword to pierce through the ashes of the burnt paper. At this moment, along with the wisp of wind brought about by his iron sword, the ashes slowly floated up. In the dim light of the night, the lakeside was very dark. That mass of gray faintly revealed a bit of red. It turned out that there were actually some sparks hidden inside. The wind swept up the ashes, and sparks danced in the air, forming a sword in the air. The sword of Mars followed the angle of the iron sword and slashed forward with a whoosh. F***CK. The space by the lake of the Orthodox Academy seemed to have been cleaved apart by this sword. The old Taoist nun's pupils constricted as she sensed a strong sense of danger. Ever since she stepped into the divine domain, she had rarely felt this way, because there were very few people on the continent that could threaten her. What was going on here? Where had that illusory sword condensed from sparks come from? Why did it make her feel danger? Countless thoughts moved with unimaginable speed through the old Taoist nun's sea of consciousness like streams of light as she incessantly calculated and deduced. But that sword of Mars had come so quickly that before she had even finished her deductions, it had already arrived in front of her. The old Taoist nun had no time to think. With a shrill whistle, the horsetail whisk hanging at her side rose up without any wind and landed in her hand. She swatted it at the sword of Mars. That horsetail whisk had thousands of threads, and each thread was like a tide. This ocean was boundless blue, but it was devoid of life, only the aura of silent extinction. She did not know where this sword of Mars that had suddenly appeared came from, but she sensed an intense danger. She attacked with her own divine Taoist technique. The horsetail whisk carried with it countless tides of silent extinction as it swatted at the sword of Mars. Compared to the frenzied waves that spanned the world, that illusory sword formed from gentle sparks seemed so insignificant, so frail. How could it be blocked? The sword of Mars was in front of Xian Yuan Po. If it was engulfed by the frenzied waves, Xian Yuan Po's body and soul would assuredly be devoured. Yet when that seemingly insignificant and frail sword of Mars encountered the frenzied waves stirred up by the horsetail whisk, not only was it not annihilated, it instantly began to blaze. The Orthodox Academy was instantly illuminated in a deep red. Both the nearby and far forests seemed to begin to burn. The sword borrowed the power of the fire to flaunt itself, transforming into a sword of fire around 7 feet long. It exuded an extremely powerful chi towards the night sky. Frenzied waves like mountains? Slay. Silent extinction like the sea? Slay. Slay all things. With a boom, the sword of fire slashed through the tens of thousands of frenzied waves, bringing with it countless strands of the horsetail whisk as it slashed at the old Taoist nun. The old Taoist nun was suddenly alarmed. With a shrill scream of extreme fear, she suddenly retreated. A section of the courtyard wall that had collapsed soundlessly earlier had completely collapsed with a loud bang as her figure retreated. The night sky was filled with the sound of space being torn apart. The massive blazing sword followed the old Taoist nun's figure as it madly chopped down. The countless strands of the horsetail whisk that had been severed drifted in the darkness. The restaurants and residences outside the walls of the Orthodox Academy loudly collapsed. The old Taoist nun's figure retreated several hundred zhang until she reached the banks of the Luo River. Only then did she manage to steady herself. The frenzied waves stirred up by her horsetail whisk were completely drenched. The calm Luo River began to surge with countless waves, the white waves incessantly rising and falling. The old Taoist nun gazed at the pursuing sword of fire, an expression of disbelief appearing on her face. She shrieked, 3 moves of the burning heaven. At this moment, she finally recognized the origins of this sword. The sparks from the embers in the furnace formed a tiny, illusory sword. It exploded in the wind, exploding with an unimaginable might. Her horsetail whisk, her silent extinction, the boundless blue sea that filled the world, was no match for this sword. Why? Because a single spark could set a prairie ablaze, and it could also burn the heavens. This sword was naturally Su Li's 3 moves of the burning heaven. With a cry of alarm, the burning heaven sword had already reached the banks of the Luo River. The Luo River at night was no longer as tranquil as it was in the past. The snowflakes falling from the sky were instantly vaporized by this sword intent into countless clouds of smoke. From the thick layers of smoke came another heaven-shaking boom, as well as the old Taoist nun's mournful and shocked cry. The mist suddenly dispersed and the dust gradually settled. The embankment on the banks of the Luo River had already collapsed for 3 li. The old Taoist nun stood in the shallow waters below the embankment, her right sleeve completely shredded, revealing skin as white as jade. Her black hair was in disarray and her body was covered in rubble. The horsetail whisk in her hand was only left with the handle and a few strands of silk. She cut an abnormally sorry figure, just like her. According to the official news, the animated version of the Heaven Choosing story will appear on Tencent Video on July 15th. Friends who have not yet enjoyed the new trailer can reply to Cartoon Trailer on WeChat. In addition, the monthly book review area welfare event will be held as scheduled today. The event has a high chance of winning prizes, and the prizes include 10,000 book coins and a set of Heaven Choosing story merchandise. The new edition of the merchandise is in the pipeline. Will the old edition be out of print? Friends who are moved, do not wait any longer. For the specific rules of the event, please move to the top of the book review area. How about it? Isn't our advertising style getting more and more formal? In addition, the press conference for the Heaven Choosing cartoon should be on the 9th. Because I'm returning to my hometown to pay my respects to my ancestors, I really can't make it in time. I truly feel very regretful. Friends in Shanghai, if you have the time, please go and support us. In addition, it's almost the end of the month. This month, because of everyone's support, the monthly tickets have always been at the front, even though I've never tried to pull any votes. Thank you all. I very seriously request everyone to see if they have any monthly tickets. If they do, please vote for Heaven Choosing Story. Thank you. Chapter 543. This is impossible, the old Taoist nun shrieked. When she sensed that her Tao heart seemed to have been cut open by the burning heaven sword, she was so shocked and furious that she was about to go mad. Why did the Orthodox Academy have a strand of Su Li's sword intent? Had Su Li guessed that she would come? After confirming that the powerful sword intent was the burning heaven sword, she had been uneasily pondering this question. But what made her even more shocked, angry, and even perplexed was, why was this sword intent so powerful? It was publicly acknowledged that Su Li was the strongest expert on the path of the sword, but how could she not even be able to receive a single sword? And this was only the sword intent Su Li had left in the Orthodox Academy, not his true sword. She was no ordinary expert. She was one of the storms of the 8 directions who had stepped into the divine domain many years ago. In the past, she had always believed that although Su Li had also stepped into the divine domain, he had done so many years later. No matter how talented he was not necessarily her match in terms of cultivation. But now, she could not even contend against a single strand of Su Li's sword intent. After anger came panic. The old Taoist nun gazed at that terrifying sword of fire, her Tao heart naturally filled with the desire to retreat. In the past, she would definitely have continued to fight, but now that she had confirmed that she was no match for Su Li, how could she not retreat? She had hidden her husband from her infiltration into the capital and had no powerful reinforcements. More importantly, Su Li was not the Pope, nor was he the Tianhai Divine Empress. He was a cold-blooded and emotionless madman. He really did dare to kill the storms of the 8 directions. The Luo River once more surged with countless waves, piling up in the snowy night like countless scraps of paper. Just before the sword intent slashed down once more, the old Taoist nun's unwilling howl resounded through the Luo River. Her figure suddenly vanished and then reappeared on the opposite shore, vanishing into the streets and alleys of the capital as quickly as possible. With her fastest speed, Chen Changsheng and the others followed the houses and restaurants that had been destroyed by the old Taoist nun. By the time they reached the shore of the Luo River, there was already no one here. There was only the fluttering snowflakes and the threads that had been cut off from the horsetail whisk, as well as the flaming sword floating in the air above the Luo River. Those threads were not willow catkins, nor were they snowflakes. Even the thinnest strand contained a terrifying might that could easily kill them. If that horsetail whisk were to strike with all its strength, it might truly be able to shake the entire Luo River, truly worthy of being a supreme expert that had stepped into the divine domain. Feeling the power within those threads, Chen Changsheng and the others subconsciously looked towards Xian Yuanpe, the first person who dared to attack the Taoist nun. They were filled with admiration, but at the same time, they thought, how strong was this flaming sword that had chopped the horsetail whisk into a featherless chicken and forced the Taoist nun to retreat? What's going on? Tang 36 asked as he looked at the burning sword in the night sky. In the first half of the night, Chen Changsheng had comprehended the sword intent on the letter and had a rough idea of what was going on. He said, "This is Senior Su Li's sword." Tang 36's lingering fear had yet to fade. He thought to himself, if not for this sword, the Orthodox Academy would have definitely flowed with rivers of blood today. Even if that old Taoist nun didn't make things too difficult for him, Chen Changsheng and Su Mo for the sake of the orthodoxy and the Wenshui Tangs, Zhexiu would definitely be humiliated and Xian Yuanpe would have no chance of survival. This battle between experts that had been fought from the Orthodox Academy to the shores of the Luo River had alarmed many people. Not long after they arrived at the shores of the Luo River, a flame descended from the night sky. Shuexing Chuan rode over on the Red Cloud Qilin as fast as he could. At the same time, The three guardians that the one Shui Tangs had dispatched to the capital finally appeared in the darkness, surrounding Tang 36. This was the first time Chun Changsheng and the others had seen the true strength of the one Shui Tangs, so they couldn't help but glance over curiously. A storm of hooves thundered through the streets. The Orthodoxy cavalry and the Imperial Guard were probably on their way. Shuexing Chuan gazed at the collapsed embankment of the Luo River and the ruins of the restaurants and residences. With a grim expression, he asked, "What happened?" "Wu Qiongbai has come," Tang 36 said. One of the storms of the eight directions had actually infiltrated the capital. Shuexing Chuan's expression flickered, and then he turned to the great sword burning in the sky above the Luo River. His expression changed once more. With his level of cultivation, he could naturally tell that this was not a real sword. To be more precise, it was an illusory sword. Yet what made him wary was that even at his level of cultivation, he felt that he was far from being a match for this sword. Thus, he didn't need to ask to know whose sword intent this was. Su Li, why would he hide this sword intent in the Orthodox Academy? He looked into Chun Changsheng's eyes and asked, "Could it be that he knew beforehand that Wu Qiongbai would act against you?" This was the matter that the old Taoist nun had least wanted to understand before her defeat, and it was also the matter that Chun Changsheng still did not understand. He had originally believed that of the two letters that Senior Su Li had entrusted Su Yurong to give him, the one that was immediately burned after reading was to help him comprehend sword intent, and the letter in his bosom was a life-saving treasure. It now seemed that Su Li clearly had some other deeper meaning in having him burn the first letter to ashes. Only by borrowing the fire of nature to ignite the sword soul could the sword intent of the burning heaven sword display its greatest might. But how had Su Li determined when to make this sword intent appear? Was it because of Xuan Yuan's unreasonable bravery, or was it because he had truly calculated ahead of time that Wu Qiongbai would come? The Orthodoxy cavalry and the Imperial Guard rushed to the scene, as did the priests of the Li Palace, as well as the officials and servants of the capital government. People began to clean up the scene, rescue the injured, and move sand and stones to stabilize the collapsed embankment of the Luo River. The scene became lively, and the burning heaven sword in the night sky restrained its light, becoming difficult to see. Shuexing Chuan was still staring at that place in the night sky. Chun Changsheng and the others were also staring at that place. This matter seemed to be coming to an end, everything returning to normal. But was it really going to be like this? For some reason, none of them believed so. They all felt that something else was about to happen. Just as expected, in the most unreasonable of moments, the night sky over the Luo River began to burn. It was as if countless golden crows had flown out of the sun and descended into the mortal world. Everywhere was incomparably bright, and the capital seemed to have transformed from night to day. The officials and soldiers laboriously working on the ruins and embankment raised their heads in shock, thinking, "What happened?" The burning heaven sword burned and grew larger. In the space of a few breaths, it had traversed the night sky. From the ground, it was at least half the length of a street. The officials and soldiers on the banks of the Luo River, as well as the awakened populace, stared at the massive sword burning in the night sky and let out countless cries of alarm. The burning heaven sword fiercely burned. No more snowflakes fell from the clouds. No more rain, not even mist. The clouds in the night sky had been cleanly burned away by the fire, gradually revealing the vast sky of stars behind them. Shuexing Chuan's face instantly paled beyond compare. He gave a shrill howl in the direction of the Imperial Palace as a warning. At the same time, he leapt onto the back of the red cloud Qilin and flew into the night sky. Chun Changsheng had also guessed at this, and his eyes brimmed with shock. He thought, "It can't be, Senior. You're about to leave, so why are you still going crazy?" The old Taoist nun could not understand why Su Li had left a strand of sword intent in the Orthodox Academy. Shuexing Chuan could not understand, and neither could Chun Changsheng. This was because no matter how high Su Li's cultivation in the path of the sword was, even if he could use his sword to calculate the heart of the heavens, it was still impossible for him to predict the movements of an expert of the divine domain and thus lay an ambush ahead of time. The strand of sword intent that Suli had left in the Orthodox Academy had never been prepared for the old Taoist nun. He had left 7 letters for the world, and the one that Chen Changsheng had immediately burned after reading had the strongest sword intent. The old Taoist nun had come to the Orthodox Academy, and Xin Yuan Po's metal sword had awakened the sword intent in that ball of ash. As a result, that sword intent had conveniently pushed back the old Taoist nun. Yes, conveniently. It was only conveniently done. Even if the old Taoist nun was one of the storms of the 8 directions, she still did not have the qualifications to make Su Li specifically use this sword intent. He did not care about her in the slightest. The person he wanted to fight, the target of this strongest sword intent, had always been that person. That person was in the Imperial Palace, had always been in the Imperial Palace. That person was no ordinary person, but a saint. A clear whistle resounded through the night sky. Xue Xingchuan rode the red cloud Qilin into the sky, transforming into a streak of fire as he thrust his spear at the burning heaven sword. Yet his spear was simply incapable of piercing the burning heaven sword. It was obstructed on the outside, and the wind howled as the streak of fire was abruptly severed, causing it to descend to the ground. Xue Xingchuan and the red cloud Qilin were jolted into the Luo River, a mouthful of blood spurting from his mouth. The massive blazing sword finally moved, carrying with it countless flames and heat. It soared into the sky from the Luo River, heading for the Imperial Palace. Seeing this incomparably magnificent sight, everyone on the ground was so shocked that they couldn't make a sound. The eyes of Chen Changsheng, Tang 36, and the others were brimming with reverence and admiration. If a cultivator of the Tao could reach this level, would they have any regrets? Zheshio's face was expressionless, but his eyes were filled with fanaticism and determination. He thought to himself, "No matter how strong you are, there will be a day when I will defeat you." After the beginning of winter, the snow in the capital continued to fall intermittently, but the clouds in the sky rarely dispersed. It was not until tonight that the sword intent transformed into a massive sword that burned the heavens and spat out endless light and heat into the world. The snowy clouds were instantly burned away, revealing specks of stars. As the burning heaven sword headed for the Imperial Palace, the snowy clouds in the night sky scattered, and stars constantly appeared. It was a very beautiful sight, like the tip of a brush painting the night sky. Countless stars incessantly shone along with the sword. The incessantly bright stars in the night sky did not sprinkle their starlight upon the mortal world, but fell upon the trajectory of the burning heaven sword, transforming into countless bright scales. The burning heaven sword had finally become a dragon. The entire capital finally woke up at this moment. Some people had not slept the entire time. When the old Taoist nun walked through that alley, the Tianhai Divine Empress woke up. She then ascended the steps and ascended the dew platform. This was the highest place in the capital besides the Mausoleum of Books. One could see the nearest starry sky, and one could also see the vastness of the mortal world. She watched as the old Taoist nun appeared outside the Orthodox Academy, her expression indifferent. She watched as a powerful sword intent appeared in the Orthodox Academy, her expression still indifferent. She only raised her brows, apparently somewhat interested. Now, that sword was traveling from the Luo River to the Imperial Palace. She stood on the dew platform, the fierce winds brushing against her perfect face, unable to disperse her indifferent expression, only causing her black hair to drift in the wind. Her hands held behind her, she stared at the approaching sword dragon in the night sky. Her expression was calm, but a hint of graveness finally appeared in her eyes. Today, there will be no more. In a little while, I will post an interview on my official WeChat account. It will be a chat with teacher Xiao Yanjun. The main reason is because of the Tencent Academy Award ceremony I mentioned last time. Posting this truly is a bit of self-boasting and shameful, but I feel that this interview contains many of my true thoughts. I want everyone to know what I think about writing books and a few other things. I want to be able to live together with everyone even more shamelessly for many more years. If everyone is interested, then go and take a look. Chapter 544. She took a step forward and arrived at the very edge of the dew platform. The night pearl and the human world were beneath her feet, the starry sky and fate above her head. She slowly spread out her hands, her wide sleeves falling down and dancing in the wind. She seemed to be standing before an abyss, cautious and careful. She seemed to be standing before a vast ocean, a majestic sight. An extremely profound and powerful aura appeared on the dew platform. With a slight shake of her wide sleeves, the night wind suddenly changed direction, moving against the wind and heading towards the burning heaven sword. Strands of black hair brushed against her face and drifted forward, slightly disheveled, adding to her beauty. Her hair trembled and the ebony hairpin stuck in her hair fell down, but it did not fall. Instead, it flew into the night sky. Everyone knew that the Divine Empress had an ebony hairpin. No matter the time, it would always be stuck in her hair. It was not because the hairpin was very beautiful, the lifelike carving of the phoenix head, but because it was no ordinary hairpin. It was the third ranked on the tier of legendary weapons, the wooden sword Little Phoenix. An extremely beautiful and incomparably solemn phoenix cry resounded through the entire capital. The ebony hairpin flew from the dew platform into the night sky. Following the starlight, it transformed into a graceful and beautiful black phoenix that was incomparably berserk. This black phoenix was so massive that it seemed capable of obscuring all the stars. It extended a claw and clawed at the blazing, burning heaven sword. A terrifying sound reverberated endlessly between the heavens and the earth. The black phoenix's right claw directly gripped the fire dragon formed from the burning heaven sword. The dragon-scaled starlight around the burning heaven sword suddenly dimmed, and then, accompanied by countless tiny cracks, it began to shatter into pieces. But the burning heaven sword seemed to have long since predicted this and directly pierced through those starlight scales. Su Li's sword was truly unsheathed. An extremely sharp sword intent covered the entire night sky. Those scattered starlight were actually cut into even finer pieces, drifting down like snowflakes. Several black feathers flew into the air. A phoenix cry resounded once more, but this time it was even more tyrannical and matchless. The black phoenix unfurled its 10-some li-long wings. The burning heaven sword stabbed into its black feathers, and its sharp beak fiercely struck the burning heaven sword's head. A stream of light shone, and then countless streams of light shone, overflowing with brilliant colors. It was indescribably magnificent. The night sky was illuminated and the world once more entered daytime. From the imperial palace to the heavenly Tao Academy, from the imperial court to the Li Palace, the protective arrays of countless buildings were stimulated by the collision of chi high up in the sky and automatically unfurled. Countless rings of clear light condensed into rings of light, almost simultaneously appearing in the streets and alleys of the capital. This scene was really too beautiful, so beautiful that it was dazzling, making people unable to look at it directly. In fact, there were indeed not many people who could see it. The stone pillars surrounding the Li Palace exuded an ancient chi. In the deepest part of the palace, the Pope quietly gazed at the night sky, cut open by the courtyard, gazed at the massive blazing sword and the black phoenix that he had not seen for a very long time, and gave a long sigh that was difficult to understand. The forest of the mausoleum of books released an even more ancient chi. The aged divine general in the pavilion at the bottom of the divine path slowly raised his head, the dust of history slowly drifting away from his armor. Even he, who had a lonely heart and a lonely Tao, had been shaken by tonight's battle. After an unknown amount of time, the flowing light in the night sky finally faded away. The thunder-like clashing chis in the sky also gradually disappeared. The snowy clouds in the surroundings slowly gathered, once more obscuring the shattered starlight. The capital once more returned to night, and the world once more grew quiet. People stood by the windows of their homes, stood in the ruins, stood by the banks of the Luo River, rubbed their stinging eyes, and once more gazed at the night sky. There was nothing in the night sky. There was no massive blazing sword, no black phoenix. All the strange phenomena had already vanished, as if nothing had ever happened. Those magnificent scenes seemed to have been imagined. Snow began to fall once more, slowly dancing in the cold wind. Chun Changsheng extended a palm and took a piece of snow. He realized that the color of the snow was not white, but gray. The people of the capital all realized that the snow falling from the night sky was actually gray, because the sword that had descended upon the capital through the night sky had originally been a piece of paper that had been burned to ash. The divine empress gazed at the ebony phoenix hairpin in her right hand and said nothing, her thoughts inscrutable. The wind on the dew platform blew away the gray snow stuck to the hairpin, revealing the hairpin's body. The dark red phoenix head on the hairpin was still as noble and beautiful as before, but if one looked carefully, one could see that a shallow sword scar had been added to the hairpin. The hairpin had originally had a shallow blade scar, and now that a sword scar had been added to it, it was not very obvious. Only she knew that this meant that Su Li was already infinitely close to the person who had left that blade scar on her hairpin. Tonight's battle was a draw. The sword intent left behind by Su Li was actually able to resist her hairpin. This was rather surprising to her. After a moment, the corners of her lips perked up, revealing a mocking smile. Don't want to leave, but have no choice but to leave. Those who are trapped by love are all mediocre. Even if the path of the sword is stronger, what can it do? She suddenly sensed something and turned to a certain place in the south of the city. Her brows perked up as she coldly said, "He actually still dares to stay. Truly a thing that doesn't know life from death." There are many people who did not want to leave, such as that old Taoist nun. She had gone to the Orthodox Academy to establish her might and kill people, but in the end, she had been forced back by Su Li's sword intent. Battered and exhausted, she had borrowed the darkness to flee. As one of the storms of the 8 directions, how could she be willing? So she had not truly left. She had borrowed the array of some noble residents in the south of the city to conceal her chi. Then she saw that battle in the night sky, standing in the quiet garden, watching the gradually fading streams of light, thinking of that massive blazing sword and that black phoenix. The old Taoist nun's complexion became abnormally unsightly. Tianhai's strength had actually reached such a high level. Could it be that the saints were all concealing their true level and were a level higher than people like her? But when had Su Li raised his cultivation to this level? After watching this battle, she was forced to admit that she was still very far from Tianhai and Su Li, and it was even highly likely that she would never be able to catch up to them in this lifetime. This fact made her feel a great sense of defeat, and then she became more and more angry, so angry that she wanted to kill people. She had not left the capital just now precisely because she wanted to kill people. Su Li's sword intent had already been shattered by the hairpin. Presumably, no one could have imagined that someone of her status and cultivation would so treacherously go to the Orthodox Academy to kill people again. Who could stop her? A venomous killing intent appeared in her eyes, and a boundless sea of ice roiled like ink. She took her almost completely bald horsetail whisk and walked towards the Orthodox Academy, her face brimming with killing intent. But just as she began to walk, a voice resounded in her ear. "I've always believed that fate is a very unreasonable thing, and I've obtained the best proof of this on your body. How could a wretched and despicable old woman like you obtain the favor of the starry sky and enter the divine domain?" This voice was very cold, very dignified. At the same time, a cold and dignified gaze descended from a very high place and fell upon the old Taoist nun. The next chapter was to be issued at 9 in the evening. Chapter 545. Upon hearing this, the old Taoist nun's expression suddenly changed. She raised her head in the direction of the dew platform and opened her mouth, wanting to say something. The Tianhai Divine Empress stood at the edge of the dew platform, her expression gazing at the southern estate. Her gaze was extremely dignified, like a real ray of light. From the moment the old Taoist nun entered the capital, she had sensed it. In the alley, the old Taoist nun had tortured a dog to death and severed Guan Bai's sword-wielding hand, which had already offended her. Perhaps in the view of many people, both that wild dog and Guan Bai were not worth mentioning when compared to the old Taoist nun. But the Divine Empress did not think this way, because this was her world. Under the blue sky, even the most festering wild dog was still her dog. Even the most unimportant person was still her people. Of course, if the old Taoist nun had obediently retreated after being forced back by Su Li's sword intent, she would have given face to the old Taoist nun's husband and not appeared. But the old Taoist nun should not have remained in the capital. This was disrespect to her. The old Taoist nun especially should not have remained in that estate. This was an exploitation of her prestige. The Divine Empress did not like it, so she did not want to hear the old Taoist nun's explanation. "Scram," she impassively said. With this word, the jade rui at her waist suddenly transformed into a stream of light, flying towards the distant southern part of the city. The jade rui transformed into a black dragon, carrying with it the power of wind and lightning. Yet it was noiseless, seeming to fuse with the darkness. In the entire capital, only 2 or 3 people could sense the appearance of this black dragon. Deep beneath New North Bridge, that little girl, her face brimming with fiendish intent, was currently eating the roast chicken that Chun Chongsheng had sent over a few days ago. At the same time, she was softly complaining that it had been many days since he had come to see her. At the same time, she was filled with the hope that she could learn the Mount Li sword style from him. In the future, if she could cultivate to Su Li's level, how could the chains on her back still hold her? Suddenly, she raised her head and frowned, a hint of fear appearing on her small face. Under the cover of the darkness, the black dragon transformed from the jade rui arrived in the southern part of the city. The word "scram" exploded in the old Taoist nun's ears like thunder. Her expression suddenly changed, and she no longer hesitated. Turning, she left. At the same time, her horsetail whisk descended, forming layers of jade sea behind her. With a whoosh, the jade rui arrived in the secluded garden, breaking through the horsetail whisk and entering. The black dragon entered the sea and set off countless storms. With a bang, the old Taoist nun's back was struck. Her clothes were torn to shreds, and she spat out a mouthful of true blood. How could she dare to stay any longer? Forcefully supporting her heavily injured body, she used a secret technique and leaped into the night, disappearing from sight. After a while, a torch was lit in the quiet garden. Tianhai Qinwu and several of his most important nephews and nephews stood under the garden wall, their complexions extremely ugly. The old Taoist nun's true blood remained on the walls and bamboos, mottled and suffused with golden light. And is angry. It's not like we're thinking of killing Chun Chongsheng. We're just thinking of dampening the orthodoxy's arrogance. Her ladyship doesn't even allow this. What does she want us to do? The Pope sat on his chair, gazing at the green leaf in the pot that was growing stronger and stronger, thinking about tonight's events. After a few moments of absent-mindedness, he muttered to himself, "Senior brother, your judgment back then was correct. She truly is stronger than everyone imagined, and I think this is still not her strongest." Besides powerful figures like the Pope and the old Taoist nun, in tonight's battle in the capital, besides Su Li's display of his world-shaking cultivation on the path of the sword, the most important event for many people was the sight of that tyrannical and peerless Black Phoenix. At this moment, everyone finally confirmed that the Divine Empress truly was as rumored, possessing the extremely noble heavenly Phoenix bloodline. It was no wonder that she doted on Su Yurong so much. From the perspective of innate talent and bloodline, she truly could treat Su Yurong as her true daughter. Only a few people knew that before and after this heaven-shaking battle between the Divine Empress and Su Li, 2 other battles had taken place in the capital. In normal times, These two battles in the divine domain would assuredly incite countless discussions in the world, but tonight, these two battles would inevitably become inconspicuous footnotes. No one knew that one of the storms of the Eight Directions, Wu Bai, had once infiltrated the capital in the middle of the night, wanting to go to the Orthodox Academy to help her beloved only son regain some face. In the end, she had been repeatedly suppressed by Su Li and the Divine Empress, two legends. Not only had she failed to regain any face, she had instead been heavily injured and left in an incomparably miserable state. It didn't take long for the 7 letters Su Li had left for the continent to finally be known. The myriad willows garden outside Hanqiu City had been burned to the ground. It was truly impossible to conceal this matter, and the Zhu clan of Tianliang County and the emotion-severing sect suddenly became much more low-key. At the same time, the longevity sect's elder Liang suddenly died of an illness, and 2 more elders were afflicted with serious illnesses. Thus, the first generation of experts that had survived that upheaval 10-some years ago withered away. The longevity sect announced to the world that it had immediately secluded itself for 3 years. Even the imminent confluence of the North and South was to remain uninvolved, no longer expressing any opinion. In such a short period of time, so many major events had occurred. Everyone knew that this was assuredly related to Su Li. What truly shocked the entire world was naturally the battle between Su Li and the Tianhai Divine Empress on that snowy night in the capital. When the news that Su Li had accompanied the Holy Maiden in seclusion had first arrived, many Southerners believed that he had been unable to resist the pressure of the people of Zhou and had thus become a deserter. However deep their love had been, how deep their hatred was now. This was especially the case when those youths of the South who had once idolized him mentioned him. Their words were filled with disrespect and incomparable hatred. However, Su Li was still Su Li. As the tallest and most towering tree in the South in the last several hundred years, how could he have left because he wanted to escape? How could he have left so calmly, silently, inconspicuously, and even somewhat aggrieved? Before leaving, he had to settle all his grudges. He had once cold-blooded and mercilessly killed many people. The world had many reasons to hate him, but he did not have too many places in the world that he needed to hate. Looking back over the past few years, only the humiliation and injuries he had suffered on his journey south from the snowy plains of the land of demons had not been washed clean. Those shameless people who had stirred up internal strife in Mount Li were still alive. So the myriad willows garden had been burned down, Zhu Luo had been crippled, and the longevity sect had gradually disappeared into the long river of history. As for the word grudge in front, it was naturally settled by the letter in Chun Chongqing's bosom, the sudden gift of tens of thousands of acres of fertile land to Scholartree Manor, and the amnesty personally issued by a famous assassin by the Tianhai Divine Empress. Of course, in his final moments, he did not forget to do something that he had actually always wanted to do, but never had the chance to do. A true contest with the Tianhai Divine Empress. Many years ago, when Su Li was still very young, he was already the world's chief assassin on the ranking of assassins. Countless people had been willing to spend countless sums of money, even a province or a county, to hire him to assassinate the Tianhai Divine Empress, but he had never accepted, not even hesitating to part ways with his subordinates. After a few years, he had already become the most senior martial granduncle in the Mount Li sword sect. The Chun imperial clan, many important figures of the South, and even the elders of his hometown, had put on countless pretexts of righteousness, words of sincerity, and even tears streaming down his face, requesting him to take his sword and enter the capital to eliminate the scourge that was the demon empress for the people of the world. But he had still not agreed. 10-some years ago, the longevity sect and the Liang household had worked together to capture his pregnant wife and force him to kill Tianhai, but he had still not done so. It was not because he did not have his current level of cultivation in the path of the sword and did not have the confidence to challenge a true saint, nor was it because he did not want the current situation to be in turmoil and the human world to fall into internal strife, thus giving the demon army a chance to invade the South. It was because at that time, it was others who wanted him to challenge Tianhai. Suli had this sort of personality. If someone wanted him to do something, the more he would not do it. Now that he was about to leave this world, no one would dare to order him to do anything, nor would anyone dare to bother him. On the contrary, he dearly wanted a test just who was stronger between him and Tianhai. The final result was no result, but he was confident that he would be very satisfied. When he left this world, Suli made it very lively for a period of time. At his core, he was a very lively person. He was very worried that a world without him would be too boring. Perhaps he was also very worried that after he left this world, it would be a very long time before he could see so much liveliness. When he ascended the stage of this world, he was incomparably glorious, shockingly talented, dazzling to the extreme. When he left this world, he was similarly vigorous and elegant. He was confident that this world would never be able to forget his name, even if he might not appear for a very long time. He had another goal in doing this, to establish might for Mount Li for the Southerners. The burning heaven sword illuminated the capital, illuminating the night sky together with the wooden phoenix sword. He was telling the Tianhai Divine Empress and the Pope that after the confluence of the North and South, they had to treat the Southerners a little better. At the same time, he was telling the entire continent not to take advantage of his absence and try to do anything to Mount Li. Otherwise, all of you will die a very ugly death like that elder of the longevity sect. Your homes and mountain gates burned to the ground like the myriad willows garden. All of this, tomorrow's chapter above. Chapter 546. Suli had left, but life still continued. That grand undertaking of the human world was still methodically advancing. In truth, it was precisely because Suli had left that there was a chance of success for that grand undertaking, that it could continue. On the 17th day after Su Yorong brought the Holy Maiden Peak faction to the capital, the Qiushan clan head and the representatives of the noble clans of the south also entered the Great Zhou dynasty. The longevity sect had been closed for 3 years, and the many sects and sects nominally subordinate to the sect had sent out capable representatives. In the following period of time, more and more representatives of the southern powers sat at the negotiating table. The confluence of North and South was no longer a term that existed only in ancient records and imagination. It was getting closer and closer to reality. To the Southerners, the greatest problem they faced was that with the departure of Su Li and the Holy Maiden, they no longer had an expert of the divine domain. Whether it was at the negotiating table or elsewhere, like the table of wine, they would always seem somewhat lacking in confidence. Unexpectedly, whether it was the Great Zhou imperial court or the orthodoxy, they did not use this change in strength to make any unreasonable demands. On the contrary, they displayed an extremely rare magnanimity and openness, making a series of guarantees and promises for the future benefits of the Southerners. Only those truly intelligent people could see the confrontation hidden behind the negotiations, or perhaps before them. It was a confrontation between Su Li and the Tianhai Divine Empress and the Pope. With unimaginable wisdom and courage, he had renounced his right to retaliate against those who had tried to kill him on the journey south and left with the Holy Maiden, causing the South to lose all confidence. Thus, this negotiation would never again have the chance to sink into the quagmire that had repeated itself countless times before. Thus, the Divine Empress and the Pope had to give him a corresponding reward, to give the South abnormally generous conditions. This reward, or generous treatment, was reflected in the details of the negotiations. After the confluence of North and South, the South would do its utmost to preserve its independence. This sort of independence had already surpassed the best imaginations of the Southern powers. There was no need to change counties, no need to merge provinces and counties. The local officials could be chosen on their own, and there was no need for the capital's Ministry of Appointments to approve them. They only needed to enter the capital every 3 years to be examined. They were also given preferential treatment in terms of taxes, and in terms of the transfer of funds from the national treasury, they were greatly biased towards the poorer and weaker counties in the South. Apart from this, the South had also gained many benefits, especially the Grand Examination and the Imperial Examination. From now on, the South no longer had to rely on the capital to allocate a portion of the Grand Examination. Instead, like the other provinces and counties, the quota was determined based on the number of registered residents. With the South's recent performance, this would give them a huge advantage in the Grand Examination. Of course, it was impossible for the Southerners to only benefit and not give anything in return. The negotiations were still far from over, and a few matters had already been confirmed. In the future, the army and external affairs would be under the unified management of the capital. The greatest change took place in the northern frontier of the snowy plains that stretched for tens of thousands of li. In the past, the sects and noble clans of the South would also send experts to join the northern fortresses to resist the demon army, but they were all guest officials who listened to orders but did not obey orders. Now, however, these experts would directly join the army, and with the addition of logistical support and other changes, it was likely that the strength of the human army would greatly increase in a very short period of time. And this had always been the most important, perhaps even the only goal of the confluence of North and South. As the negotiations for the unification of the North and South gradually progressed toward success, the experts and armies of the human world also increased their vigilance towards the North. Rations and supplies from the South were continuously transported to 11 important border passes, ready to deal a heavy blow to the demon cavalry heading south at any moment. This was because it was very clear that the demon race would not just watch as the human world's unification of the North and South succeeded. They would definitely do something, especially that extremely treacherous military advisor Blackrobe. Perhaps he had already begun to carry out his crafty schemes. The situation in the North was a bit tense, and the two sides of the negotiation table in the capital were also a bit tense, but the tense mood was different. Su Yurong played an extremely important role in the confluence of North and South. It could even be said that on the spiritual level, she was the most important representative because she was a Zhou citizen and also the saintess of the South. Naturally, her schedule also became busy. She constantly summoned representatives of the forces in the South and, at the same time, communicated with the Zhou imperial court. Fortunately, she lived in the royal palace, so it was very convenient for her to meet the Divine Queen. Shang hadn't seen her for more than 10 days. He missed her a bit, but he knew that she was doing something extremely important, so he obviously wouldn't have any complaints. As a person who treasured time the most, he didn't waste his time on missing her or waiting. He used the cold of the deep winter to continuously polish his spirit, perceive the 5 stone pearls, silently memorize the having blade technique, and occasionally give lessons to the freshmen of the Tradition Academy. Most of the time, he was still constantly studying, but of course, he didn't forget some other important matters. On a normal winter day, with wind and snow, he bought a large amount of food and trinkets from the street market. He held up the yellow paper umbrella and avoided the countless eyes around the Tradition Academy. Under the eyes of the royal guards, he walked to the tree outside of the palace wall. Then, while the wind was blowing and the snow was blinding his eyes, he jumped into the well at New North Bridge. The most oil-absorbent paper was spread on the ground, taking up half the size of a house. Countless types of hot food were neatly arranged on top, giving off the same steam and different fragrances. There was steamed deer tail, roasted goose, roasted duck, and a dozen or so skewers of rice dumplings, but this time there was no steamed bear paw, because of Xian Yuan Pa. No one in the Tradition Academy currently ate that. Shang used 2 fingers to pull out a clean handkerchief from his sleeve, carefully wiping off the oil and water on his hand. He raised his head and looked at the Black Dragon, saying, "Tang Tang turned Clear Lake Restaurant into the Tradition Academy's dining hall. I forgot to tell you, but besides Blue Lobster, I still bought everything else from outside. I feel like they taste better." In the middle of the floor, full of food, there was a small mountain of blue lobster. When Shang said these words, he was smiling. His smile was very clean, containing a joy that came from his heart. To be able to make so many good things for the Black Dragon to eat, he really felt very satisfied. The Black Dragon's mountainous body slowly descended. An indescribably cold aura instantly suppressed the steam emitted by the food. Chun Chang Shung hurriedly unsheathed his sword and slashed. A sword intent, faintly imbued with a glow of fire, pierced through the air. The food was instantly heated up, not frozen into ice. He used the burning heaven sword. A few nights ago, he had comprehended the sword intent in that letter for a very long time. Afterwards, he saw Su Li's burning heaven sword and the divine Empress Ebony Phoenix hairpin battle. So he had improved somewhat. Although his current path of the sword could not be said to have reached great heights, in his current level of cultivation, it could already be called incomparably perfect. But using the burning heaven sword, which was extremely difficult to completely comprehend, to heat up the food, no matter how one looked at it, seemed somewhat inappropriate. The black dragon did not think so. She felt that it was extremely appropriate. She was very satisfied with the floor full of food and the small mountain of blue lobster that Chun Changsheng had spent so much effort to prepare. She was even more satisfied with Chun Changsheng's method of using the burning heaven sword to heat up the food, because this meant that in his eyes, letting her eat fresh and hot food was much more important than maintaining the so-called dignity of the path of the sword. She decided to forgive him for not coming here to see her for almost a month. A dignified and distant, simple yet incomparably complex dragon cry resounded through the gloomy and cold underground. Qin Changsheng was slightly taken aback. He did not understand why the black dragon was not in a hurry to eat, but wanted him to first attend the dragon language lessons. But then he suddenly remembered that he had already delivered food to the black dragon so many times, but he had seemingly never seen her eat anything in front of him. From time to time, the black dragon's low and dignified dragon cry would rise up from underground. Chun Changsheng clumsily and earnestly learned to speak. Chun Changsheng was extremely focused on learning. Even when his voice was hoarse, his sea of consciousness was empty, and his body was extremely weak. But he did not forget to every so often, he would slash down with the burning heaven sword at his side, helping the roast goose and roast duck maintain their original fragrance at the most appropriate temperature. The black dragon's whiskers would also occasionally float up, sprinkling down snowflakes that landed on the small mountain of blue lobsters. It was a very beautiful sight. After some time, today's dragon language lessons finally came to an end. The black dragon lightly exhaled at his face, and a layer of frost instantly appeared on his face. He stretched out his hand and rubbed away the frost. He only felt a wave of coldness, and his mind was refreshed. All his exhaustion instantly vanished without a trace. "I'll go over there and take a look." Chun Changsheng didn't forget the most important thing. He flew backwards and saw the two iron chains. The other end of the chains was on the stone wall, held in the hands of those two legendary divine generals. Compared to the black dragon's mountainous body, these two chains were like two strands of hair, yet they were able to firmly lock the black dragon in place. Presumably, in the past several hundred years, the black dragon had tried countless methods to break these two chains, but to no avail. In the half a year since returning to the capital from the Garden of Zhou, Chun Changsheng had thought of many methods, but they had all failed. The array that Wang Jitze had laid down on the stone wall was far too complex and wondrous, like a sea of stars. The two divine generals, Yu Gong and Qin Zhong, had attached strands of spiritual sense to the stone wall. They were far too powerful and violent, like lightning. It had been almost 1,000 years since the last time the wildflowers had bloomed, but those legends were still legends. Even if they had already transformed into strands of heroic souls, they were still not existences that the current hymn could contend against. It was not even a domain that the current hymn could touch. That domain was called the divine. Chun Changsheng sat at the bottom of the stone wall, quietly reading the book in his hands under the gazes of these legends. The book he was reading was rather old. Its name was Illustrated Notes on the Array of the Reverend Xiang. No one knew the exact lineage of Wang Jitze's teacher. Back then, that ordinary teacher of the Heavenly Tao Academy had suddenly become a star that illuminated the capital in his middle age, his name shaking the continent. No one knew who his teacher was. He had flipped through several hundred books in the library of the Orthodox Academy, and in Wang Jit's hometown, he had found an ordinary Taoist priest surnamed Wu. Wang Jit's hometown was Shiyang. That Taoist priest surnamed Wu was the Reverend Shiyang. The next chapter, 8 p.m., Chapter 547. The ordinary Taoist priest with the surname Wu was not famous at all. He had only written 3 books in his life, and one of them was the book on array diagrams. In the beginning, Chen Chongsheng only glanced at it casually and didn't have much hope, but the more he looked, the more he felt something was off. The arrays that Taoist had recorded in the array atlas were all very simple, even a little clumsy. For those who had cultivated the way, they were completely worthless, but on a few of the pages, Chen Chongsheng could faintly see traces of the boiling stone forest array. Time passed by slowly. Chen Chongsheng continued to read. He didn't have a trace of anxiety or irritation. His eyes were calm and determined. He had promised the Black Dragon that he would save her, so he would definitely do it. Not this year, not next year, but 1 year he would be able to do it. He firmly believed that the Black Dragon would not be imprisoned underground for another few centuries. Of course, all of this was based on the premise that he could live past the age of 20. A few nights ago, I saw a burning sword. It was very powerful. A cold and crisp voice rang out behind him. At some point, the Black Dragon had noiselessly floated behind him. When it mentioned the blazing sword, a hint of fear flashed through its eyes. That is Su Li's sword? Chen Chongsheng had already confirmed the Black Dragon's gender and had heard her voice before, but he still wasn't used to it. In the 10,000 li journey south, because the Black Dragon had helped him suppress his injuries in the Garden of Zhou, it had consumed too much of its soul and spent the vast majority of its time sleeping. However, it had to be admitted that there was another important reason why it was not willing to wake up. It did not want to be discovered by Su Li. At that time, Su Li was heavily injured, not even comparable to an ordinary person. The Black Dragon still instinctively feared him. At the very beginning, in the hot springs of the snowy mountains, she had sensed that Su Li's sword had once slain many of her clansmen, even clansmen stronger than her. Senior Su Li and the Divine Empress fought. The final result should be a draw, right? What about you? You haven't come to see me for so many days. You must be very busy. What are you busy with? I'm looking for books related to formations. Chen Chongsheng glanced at the portraits of the 2 divine generals on the stone wall and continued. Other times, I'm preparing for a battle. You're the next pope. Who dares to challenge you? So many people. You don't have to fight them. That person won't do. Who? Su Yurong. Your fiancé? For some reason, the Black Dragon's voice had become indifferent, its tone much less fluctuating. Chen Chongsheng didn't notice this and said, I don't know if she's still my fiancé. A complicated look flashed through the Black Dragon's eyes. Tell me about it. After hesitating for a moment, Chen Chongsheng told the Black Dragon everything that had happened in the past few days. No matter if it was before or after the Bridge of Helplessness, or after that snowy night when he entered the palace, he didn't even hide the tiniest of emotions in his heart. This was the first time he told Tang 36 about what happened between him and Su Yurong. Even though he told Tang 36 about it, he never told him the details. The reason why he didn't hide anything from the Black Dragon was because the Black Dragon had saved his life many times. He trusted the Black Dragon very much. Even though he knew that the Black Dragon had a long lifespan and this Black Dragon had just entered puberty, it had lived for hundreds of years. He would subconsciously treat the Black Dragon as a respected elder. In short, he trusted the Black Dragon very much and felt it was very convenient. So he told the Black Dragon everything without leaving out any details. The underground space was quiet. A layer of frost suddenly appeared on the stone wall, covering the faces of the 2 legendary divine generals. The Black Dragon floated down. Its jet-black eyes reflected Chen Chongsheng's figure. It then slowly opened its mouth. In a recent few visits to New North Bridge, whenever Chen Chongsheng was studying the formation and thinking of a method to help the Black Dragon escape, to the point of being both mentally and physically exhausted, the Black Dragon would lower its noble head and spit out a light and refreshing dragon breath, helping Chen Chongsheng dispel his fatigue and recover his spirit, just like before. Chen Changsheng was already used to this. Seeing the black dragon's actions, he naturally closed his eyes and prepared to welcome the coldness of the black dragon. A woo! A low and stern dragon's roar resounded. A dragon breath fell upon Chen Changsheng's face and body. It wasn't the coldness of the black frost dragon, but the true dragon breath of the black frost dragon. In an instant, Chen Changsheng's body was frozen, becoming a transparent block of ice. The water lightly lapped against the block of ice, creating a splashing sound. This wasn't the Luo River, but rather the small pond within the Imperial Palace. Because of the formation, the Imperial Palace was like spring all year round. Although the pond was small, it wasn't frozen. To Chen Changsheng, this was both a good and bad thing. A massive, transparent block of ice was constantly bobbing up and down in the pond. He was frozen within the block of ice. The reason why the pond wasn't frozen was a good thing was because under the washing of the water, the block of ice would quickly melt. The reason why it wasn't a good thing was because the pond was constantly swaying and the block of ice was sinking uneasily, occasionally rolling about. He was very uncomfortable and very embarrassed inside. The feeling of embarrassment would usually only occur when one was in an embarrassing situation and was seen by others. If no one was watching, it didn't matter if you were like Tang 36, hugging a tree in the snowy forest and burping, or if you were like him right now, being frozen in the block of ice and floating up and down with the waves. It didn't matter. Chen Changsheng felt very embarrassed right now because someone was constantly watching him. Accurately speaking, it wasn't a person. The black goat stood beside the pond, slightly tilting its head, watching him in the block of ice in the pond. It had already watched for a very long time and seemed to find this very interesting. It actually didn't leave. As a result, Chen Changsheng felt more and more embarrassed. If he could break the block of ice right now, he obviously would have done it long ago, but the black frost dragon's breath was indeed extraordinary. It directly froze his sea of consciousness and body. Even though he had completely mastered the burning heaven sword and could condense sword essence into flames, he still couldn't break the block of ice around him. He used a very long time and could only barely melt the thin layer of ice on his face. He could barely open his eyes. Time passed slowly. The block of ice continued to float up and down. The black goat continued to watch with interest, as if it didn't understand what he was doing. Or was he practicing some sort of Tao technique? The ice in front of Chen Changsheng's face melted more and more. After opening his eyes, he could finally open his mouth. He hurriedly shouted to the black goat, "Please help me." Because of this shout, the ice water flowed into his mouth and nose, choking him uncomfortably. Although the voice was very weak, the black goat understood the shape of his mouth. Just like every time in the past 2 years, whenever Chen Changsheng needed help, the black goat would always respond to his request. The black goat slowly walked into the pond and used its horn to push the large block of ice back onto the stone steps. It then lowered its head and exerted a little force. A crisp crack could be heard. The block of ice split open and Chen Changsheng fell down. His entire body was drenched by the ice water. He was frozen to an extremely miserable state. His face was pale. His ethereal palace and sea of consciousness were both invaded by the cold. He had actually suffered significant internal injuries. A trace of fear and confusion flashed through his eyes. Why did the black dragon suddenly become so cruel and ruthless? How did he offend it? The snowy clouds above the imperial palace gradually dispersed, revealing a faint sun that seemed like a fake. No matter how faint it was still a real sun. Sunlight was warm. Chen Changsheng took out a spare set of clothes from his scabbard. Because his hands and feet were frozen stiff, it took him a long time to change. He leaned against the pillar of the cold and cheerless palace. He closed his eyes and began to use the sunlight to recover his body temperature. The black goat slowly bent its front limbs and quietly crouched beside him. It then slowly closed its eyes. After a long time, when Chen Changsheng thought back to this day in the winter of that year, he would always feel a lot of sorrow and a faint sense of loss. At that time, he was still very young. He didn't understand many things and didn't notice many details. Those details were in the underground, illuminated by the luminous pearls, and by the pond, illuminated by the sunlight. He thought that the black dragon was his senior. She was someone he could trust. She was someone he could easily talk to. In this statement, there were two absolute mistakes. The black dragon was obviously worthy of his trust, but she wasn't his senior. She felt it was very inconvenient for her to listen to the story between Chun Changsheng and Su Yurong, because she was a little girl. She had enough reason to be angry. In the dark and cold underground cavern, the little girl was eating. She didn't want to eat in the form of the black dragon in front of Chun Changsheng. That would be too clean. It wouldn't be beautiful. She was afraid of scaring him. But Chun Changsheng didn't understand. So she was angry. She heard that Chun Changsheng and Su Yurong met on the bridge of helplessness. She was also angry. In the past, she had always thought that it would be great if he never knew about this matter. In the end, she didn't know if it was because of the food or because she was angry, but her cheeks were slightly puffed up and her beautiful little face was filled with an unhappy expression. The cinnabar scar between her brows was filled with killing intent, and her dignified vertical pupils were now filled with grievance. Heartless man, if it wasn't because you also had a wound between your eyebrows on the bridge of helplessness, similar to me, I would have swallowed you in one bite. She held the blue lobster in her hands. She bit like a sugar cane. At the same time, she thought fiercely and angrily. It didn't take long for the dozens of dishes that Chun Changsheng brought were all eaten by her. Under her black clothes, her stomach only slightly puffed up. Then, she slowly lowered her head and sat in her own shadow. Actually, she didn't care what she ate. Whatever she ate, she would eat alone. She just didn't want to eat alone. She already ate alone for hundreds of years. She wanted to have someone to eat with. Or not eat. Chatting was fine. Not chatting was fine. Sitting was fine. Yesterday, I said that I would only write one chapter today. But in the afternoon, I felt that my condition was good. I decided to write another chapter. But when I was locked in the little black room, I typed too many words. I still haven't finished it. I'm really sorry for making everyone wait. Chapter 548. Chun Changsheng leaned against the pillar and sat for a long time. He didn't open his eyes until the sun moved west and his body warmed up. The black goat walked in front of him and prepared to lead him away. Chun Changsheng looked at it and shook his head. I still have something to do. He continued to sit where he was and looked at the ice in the pond. He didn't say anything. No one knew what he was thinking. A hint of confusion appeared in the black goat's eyes that were as dark as the night. After a long time, Chun Changsheng stood up. He didn't leave the imperial palace to return to the Orthodox Academy. He went to another palace. He had come to this palace many times. Every time, he came at night and talked to her through the window. This was the first time he entered the palace. Shuang entered the palace as expected. Her face paled when she saw him. She almost cried out in surprise. She calmed down a little. Her hand trembled as she poured tea and almost splashed it on him. Don't worry about it. I can say with certainty that she didn't want to take revenge on you. Su Yurong looked at him calmly. What happened? She was very clear that since she had made a request, then under normal circumstances, Chun Changsheng would definitely not take the risk of being discovered to see her. Chun Changsheng hesitated for a moment. I have a friend. He's been trapped in a place for a long time. I want to save him. Su Yurong was silent for a moment. She asked softly, and he might have done something wrong in the past, but he's been trapped for a long time. He's really pitiful. Chun Changsheng didn't know how to describe this matter. His words were a bit messy. But I have no way, so Su Yurong didn't wait for him to finish. She looked at his eyes and asked, Are you sure you want to do this? Chun Changsheng was surprised. He said seriously, Yes, I want to do this. Su Yurong looked at his eyes. Your friend is Zhu Sha? Chun Changsheng was confused. Zhu Sha. Su Yurong didn't expect it. You don't know her name? Chun Changsheng was surprised. You know who I'm talking about? Su Yurong said. Zhu Sha is Xiao Longnu's name. It said that Master Wang Ji Su gave it to her. Chun Changsheng looked at her in surprise. You know about the black dragon? Su Yurong nodded. Chun Changsheng was silent for a long time. The black dragon was a taboo in the Zhou royal palace, a secret that very few people knew of. But Su Yurong was the holy maiden and had been educated by the divine queen since childhood, so knowing of this matter wasn't hard to imagine. So, her name is Zhusha. So you don't know. Why was Lord Wang Jitsa the one who named her? Many years ago, the Golden Dragon tribe suddenly disappeared, and the noble Black Frost Dragon became the sole candidate for leader of the Dragon tribe. However, the most powerful Black Frost Dragon of that generation had a soul that yearned for freedom and was unwilling to bear this responsibility. She stealthily came to the human world and then met Zhou Dufu. And then, the noblest, strongest, and proudest Black Frost Dragon in 1,000 years perished just like that, becoming the garden of Zhou's Sunset Valley. Chen Changsheng was silent. Back in the garden of Zhou, he had seen with his own eyes the magnificent sight of that winding mountain range seemingly ablaze in the twilight. He had also sensed the abnormality of the Black Dragon's divine soul. But how could he have imagined that Sunset Valley was actually the body of a Black Frost Dragon that had perished? And then, Zhusha was the daughter of that Black Frost Dragon. For some reason, she left the Dragon Island of the Southern Sea and came alone to the human world. According to the records of the Li Palace and the Imperial Court, she said that when her father left, he forgot to bestow her a name, and the name that her clan elders gave her was too long, too ugly, and too hard to remember. She didn't like it, so she came to the human world. She wanted to find her father and ask him to give her a nicer sounding name. She just wanted a name? Yes, so in those years, she was also called the Evil Dragon in search of name. Evil Dragon? Yes, after she came ashore from the Southern Sea, she destroyed many fishing villages and towns, killed many people, and even almost caused chaos in the capital. You should know what happened afterwards. Lord Wang Jitsa planned to capture her, and then use that array to imprison her under New North Bridge. Chen Sheng shook his head. That's not called planning, that's called deception. Su Yurong thought it over, then said, that's true. Chen Sheng asked, why did Wang Jitsa give her the name Zhusha? Su Yurong noticed that when he mentioned Wang Jitsa this time, he did not add the words lore behind it, and she couldn't help but smile. No one knows why, but Lord Wang Jitsa must have a deeper meaning for this name. She glanced at him with a meaningful look. Chen Sheng did not notice, asking, then how old is she now? If the lifespan of a dragon race is equal to that of humans, then she should be 1 or 2 years younger than us. Although I thought about it, it still felt a little strange back then. I always called her senior. Do you still want to rescue her? Yes, even if she once committed monstrous crimes. You said that she's 1 or 2 years younger than us. So how old was she when she left the Southern Sea and came to the human world? 1 or 2 years. Chen Changsheng was quiet for a while, then said, I don't know what happened in those fishing villages and towns back then, nor do I have any intention of defending her, but she was just an infant back then. Even if she committed monstrous crimes, she has been imprisoned for several centuries, which should be enough. Su Yurong very seriously thought this over, then softly said, it really is enough. Chen Changsheng was very happy that she shared the same view on this matter, but no matter how slow-witted he was, he still knew that his request was somewhat inappropriate. Thus, he did not become elated, but instead became even more cautious. Even his voice became much softer. Can you help me? Su Yurong earnestly replied. Of course I can, but besides the divine empress and his holiness, who else can undo the array left behind by Lord Wang Jitsa? Chen Changsheng recalled his conversation with his martial uncle the Pope in the Li Palace after returning to the capital from the Garden of Zhou and shook his head. Su Yurong understood and said, although I didn't see it with my own eyes, I can imagine that this array is probably not something we can undo at our current level. We can't just keep waiting like this. After many more years, New North Bridge won't become a real bridge. That's not necessarily true. Even a vast sea can become a mulberry field. The power of time is far more powerful than we imagine. The next chapter, 8 o'clock. Chapter 549. Do we have to wait another few centuries? Perhaps we really should study the power of time. No matter how powerful those legends were back then, they couldn't surpass time. Of the 3,000 scriptures of the Taoist canon, there's only one scroll of time. Then let's first look at that scroll. I understand. When the time comes, please help me study it. With his mind set and the sky darkening, Chun Changsheng stood up, bid farewell, and walked out of the hall. Shuang'er stood on the snowy ground outside the hall, constantly paying attention to what was going on outside. When she saw him walk out, she had a very complicated expression. Chun Changsheng was prepared to say something to her when he suddenly heard Su Yorong's voice from behind him. "You're very close to Lady Zhusha?" Chun Changsheng froze for a moment before realizing that the Lady Zhusha she spoke of was the little black dragon. Confused, he asked, "Close? And Mo, you saw you two hugging each other." It was obvious that Su Yorong was intentionally keeping her voice calm, because it was so calm that it was almost stiff. Chun Changsheng was speechless. He thought, the black dragon is like a mountain. How can I hug her? Don't you know, if she doesn't maintain her dragon body, she would be a pretty girl? Night had fallen. Chun Changsheng silently gazed at the calm pond and the shattered ice on its surface. The girl and the black dragon might have only changed their appearances, but the feeling they gave off was completely different. There was a huge difference between having a name and not having a name. In the past, Wang Jitsa had given her a name, Zhusha. He had also given her two names, Zhiji and Hongzhuang. There seemed to be a faint connection between the two. The black frost dragon that had died in battle in the Garden of Zhou had a noble and limitless soul that yearned for freedom. She was the daughter of that black frost dragon. Presumably, she also had a heart that yearned for freedom, yet she had been imprisoned for so many years. It was truly pitiful. He did not speak to the pond, but left. On the same night, he used the stone pearl left behind by Wang Jitsa to enter the Garden of Zhou. He paid no attention to the low tide of monsters. He only noticed that the current Garden of Zhou was much better than before. The lakes around the plain had already been dredged clean, and the collapsed cliffs had already been tidied up. He went to the lakeshore on the other side of the waterfall and found the scroll of time amongst the dried books on the rocks. He returned to Sunset Valley. Borrowing the light from the distant horizon, he began to read. After a long time, he put away the scroll and said to the majestic mountains in front of him, "Please rest assured, I will save your daughter." In the courtyard of the Northern Military Department's alley, Zhou Tong was also reading the scroll of time. At present, the common people only remembered him as a cruel and terrifying minister. They had long since forgotten that he had once been renowned for his erudition, and that he was a peak star condensation cultivator who had attained the Tao. Ever since Archbishop Mei Lisha had returned to the Sea of Stars, he had been studying the scroll of time. It was only recently that he had finally comprehended the true meaning of this Taoist scripture. Can it really change the flow of time? As he gazed at the snow in the courtyard and the lonely crabapple tree in the snow, the sea of blood in the depths of Zhou Tong's eyes incessantly roiled, seeming abnormally tyrannical and terrifying. This represented that his mind was currently in a state of shock, his sea of consciousness uneasy. Even his callous Tao heart found it somewhat difficult to control. As time passed, the sea of blood in his eyes gradually calmed, and his pale face began to show signs of exhaustion and sorrow. He knew that ever since he had decided to follow the Divine Empress in opening a golden age and sank into this sea of blood that would never recover, it was impossible for him to reach the end of the long path of cultivation. Whether it was time or space, there were both domains that he could no longer touch. However, this did not mean that there was no one in this world who could do this. He believed that if he could enter the legendary concealed divinity realm, or perhaps if he could borrow the help of some extremely powerful array, he really might be able to use the scroll of time to change the flow of time. This also meant that a certain person's age might have been altered by someone. Perhaps that youth was the same age as Crown Prince Xiaoming? Two rumors were spreading through the capital. The first rumor was rather nonsensical. It said that little Principal Chun of the Orthodox Academy was a descendant of the Chun imperial clan, and was even highly likely to be that Crown Prince Xiaoming who had disappeared during the coup in the palace. No one believed this rumor, because Chun Changsheng was clearly much younger than Crown Prince Xiaoming. Moreover, compared to this somewhat shocking rumor, The common people of the capital were more willing to believe the even colder and sinister rumor. The pitiful crown prince Zhao had long since been smothered to death in his swaddling clothes by the divine empress. The second rumor aroused the interest of even more people, and it also obtained even more people's approval. Perhaps Tang 36 had drunk too much that night and told the dancer in the restaurant. Perhaps Schwanger had returned to the divine general of the East estate to retrieve the hand warmer that the young lady often used, and had been indirectly probed by the madam and revealed the matter. Perhaps it was even more likely that some truly powerful person had occasionally looked down from a high platform in the capital and discovered the scene of that young man and woman walking side by side. The yellow paper umbrella had not been able to cover Chen Chongqing's face. Many of the people of the capital had heard that in the days after the Battle of the Bridge of Helplessness, the Holy Maiden and Little Principal Chen often met, and it was said that Little Principal Chen would occasionally enter the palace to visit her. Today was Prince Chen Lu's treat day, and Chen Chongsheng was the main guest. The theme of today's gathering was to admire the snow. While admiring the snow, of course, they had to recite poems. The few students of the Tradition Academy who followed Chen Chongsheng to the palace to broaden their horizons lost to the students of the Five Ivies in a few rounds of poetry debate. Now the status of Chen Chongsheng and the Tradition Academy was completely different from before. No matter if it was the teachers or students of the Heavenly Academy or the Priest Academy, no one dared to use this incident to mock them. However, the students of the Tradition Academy still felt that they had lost some face, and they kept sneaking glances at Chen Chongsheng. Of course, Chen Chongsheng felt these glances, and he naturally began to miss Tang 36. That guy was the best person to handle this kind of situation. No matter if he was mocked, humiliated, or ignored, or if his side's morale was low or even fell into despair, he always had a way to turn the atmosphere around. Just like before, Tang 36, who didn't like Prince Chen Lu for some reason, didn't even bother to give an excuse. He directly refused to participate in today's poetry gathering, but he didn't stay too far away. He sat in the carriage of the Tradition Academy with his dancer and waited outside the palace. He pointed at the falling snow outside the window and recited poems, acting like a playboy. The gate of the palace opened, and Prince Chen Lu personally escorted Chen Chongsheng and the others out. The falling snow had already stopped. A lot of the citizens of the capital who liked to watch a show had gathered outside the palace. At this time, as Chen Chongsheng appeared, countless gazes were instantly focused on him. At the same time, countless whispers were heard. The quiet street in front of the palace seemed to have become a classroom. Chapter 550. Men are all perverts. It said that little Principal Chen doesn't lust after women, but now it looks like it's fake. Once he sees the Holy Maiden's beauty, doesn't he immediately regret it? The people who said this were all women. Who can still have a heart of steel after seeing the Holy Maiden's face? Plus, little Principal Chen and the Holy Maiden were already engaged. How can he control himself? The people who expressed their understanding towards Chen Chongsheng, but still had a teasing tone in their words, were all men. Why do you think the principal was so stupid back then and wanted to break off the engagement? Who said the principal broke off the engagement? Wasn't it just a rumor without any proof? The palace sent out the news a long time ago. The Hall of Subjugation didn't even see the shadow of the marriage contract. So what if he broke off the engagement? I'm just curious about what happened back then. It's a very long story. 2 years ago, in the spring, the principal came to the capital from Xining village and knocked on the door of the divine general of the East estate. Tisk to be humiliated and suppressed like this by the divine general's estate, even I can't stand it, let alone the principal. The principal worked hard to get to where he is now because he was provoked too much back then. Now that he has power, of course he wants to slap the divine general's estate in the face. That's why I say, don't bully the young for being poor. As long as we work hard and cultivate, we can also be so high-spirited in the future. But, according to those rumors, could it be that the dean is regretting it now? Isn't that slapping himself in the face? That's what you said. The above conversation happened among the students of the Tradition Academy. Increasing one's cultivation level would bring many benefits, but it would also bring many unexpected troubles. For example, your five senses would become much sharper. Even if a woman covered her mouth and said no, even if a man on the street laughed and joked with him, or even if a student from your own academy whispered to each other, it would all be clearly heard. Chun Changsheng sat in the carriage and looked at the snowflakes outside the window. He looked very calm, but his slightly clenched fist showed that he was actually a little embarrassed. Tang 36 sent the dancer back, and now sat across from Chun Changsheng. Looking at Chun Changsheng's expression, Tang 36 sneered. Chun Changsheng seemed to be focused on the snow, but in reality, he cared a lot about the reactions around him. Ever since that rumor spread, he became a little sensitive. What are you laughing at? Laughing at your stupidity. The carriage once again became quiet, an awkward silence. Tang 36 looked at him and said with extreme disdain, "Back then in the Plum Garden Inn, I said that you and Su Yu Rong were people that made people speechless. Now it seems that you two are also examples of people who seek death." Every time I talked about this matter, Tang 36 would casually say something to make Chun Changsheng speechless. He had nothing to say to this, so he could only change the subject. Very seriously, he asked for guidance. "Back then, I once asked Luo to help me investigate that elf girl in the Garden of Zhou. Now that I know it's a misunderstanding, I want to write to her and tell her, but I also feel that it's not very appropriate. What do you think?" Tang 36 looked at him disdainfully and said, "What do you think? If you don't think this is inappropriate, then you really are a pig. Then what should we do? I'll write a letter to Princess Luluo, and then you can mention it in your letter." Tang 36 gave his own idea. Chun Changsheng thought about the whispers he had heard outside the estate and still felt somewhat depressed. He asked, "Why doesn't she agree to me going to the Divine General's estate to propose?" "Propose?" Tang 36 looked at him and asked, "And then what?" Chun Changsheng said very naturally, "I go and propose, and then she agrees. Won't those rumors end then?" Tang 36 asked, "Why do you think she will agree to marry you?" Chun Changsheng was stunned. "Do I even need to think about it? If you go to the Divine General of the East Estate to propose, will Su Shiji agree? Or are you hoping that Su Yu Rong will insist?" Tang 36 looked at him and said angrily, "Back then, it was you who cried and yelled to break off the engagement, and now you want her to cry and yell to marry you? Don't you think about how humiliating she will be if you do that?" Chun Changsheng really had never thought about this problem, but now that he thought about it, he realized that it really was very reasonable. "Then what should I do?" "Endure, endure, endure, until she feels that it's enough and begins to sympathize with you." Because of the matter brought about by the confluence of the North and South, and also because of the rumors circulating around the capital, it became harder and harder for Chun Changsheng to see Su Yu Rong. Just when he was gazing at the sky full of snowflakes, somewhat muddle-headedly wondering when these days would end, he received an unsigned letter. This letter was not Su Li's, but Su Yu Rong's. Standing on the other side of the lake, under the newly built academy wall, he finished reading this letter. The corners of his lips perked up, revealing a smile that came from the bottom of his heart. He then went to the library, and under the slightly surprised gazes of the students, he swiftly wrote a letter. This letter was not a reply, but a letter to the Pope. In the letter, he said that in order to prepare for next year's Boiling Stone Summit, he wanted to stabilize his cultivation and solidify his foundation for star condensation. He wanted to once more enter the mausoleum of books to view the monoliths and comprehend the Tao. On the same night, he received the Pope's reply. In the letter, the Pope expressed his praise and gratification for his eagerness to study, and gave him his blessings for once more entering the mausoleum of books to view the monoliths and comprehend the Tao. Then at the end of the letter, he said that in the future, if he wanted to enter the mausoleum of books, he only needed to record it in the Li Palace. There was no need to specially write a letter to him. Only when he saw these words on the letter did Chun Changsheng truly experience some sort of change. The mausoleum of books was not a place that could be entered just because one wanted to. Countless cultivators of the continent, in order to obtain the right to enter the mausoleum of books, either fought bloody battles against the demons in the north to accumulate military merit, or strove to advance in the grand examination, striving to enter the top 3. But in the end, only a small number of people succeeded. But to the current him, the Mausoleum of Books was a place that he could enter whenever he wanted. He was no longer that young Taoist from Xining Village. He was the principal of the Orthodox Academy, the Pope's martial nephew, the future Pope. He was still very young, but he was already an important figure. The heavy stone door slowly opened, causing the ground to tremble. As he gazed at the mausoleum before him that was still green in the depths of winter, Chen Changsheng very naturally recalled the shock he felt when he first arrived here 1 year ago. The priests and cavalry that guarded the Mausoleum of Books looked at the youth standing in front of the cardinals and guessed at his identity. They couldn't help but feel rather complicated. Chen Changsheng walked into the Mausoleum of Books. This time, he was not a tourist, nor was he a monolith viewer. It was more like he had come to inspect. This sort of feeling was made incomparably real by the respectful attitudes of the cardinals at his side. He refused the residence that the Li Palace had arranged for him and went straight to the grass hut that Sun Mei had left behind. It had been a very long time since anyone had lived in the grass hut. There was some dust on the sides of the pot, and the cured meat hanging from the beam had not been finished. The fence in the courtyard, however, was much sturdier than it had been when he was here. He didn't know if it had been Tang 36 or Guan Feibai who had repaired it. When he thought of the time when he had cooked here, watched the sun, and viewed the monoliths, he began to miss it. Tang 36 and Zhexiu could be seen every day in the Orthodox Academy, but Go Hanshi and the others had not been seen for a year. He didn't know how they were doing in Mount Li. A voice came from outside the fence. Perhaps it was because the winter sweet in the forest was in full bloom, but it brought with it a clear and cold fragrance. This is Senior Sun Mei's residence? Chen Changsheng awoke from his memories and turned around to look. He saw Su Yurong standing outside the fence. In the forest outside the fence, the plum blossoms were in full bloom. She stood there, bathed in the morning light. She was as beautiful as a flower. Chen Changsheng could now enter the Mausoleum of Books as he pleased. She was the holy maiden, so she could naturally as well. He said, "Yes, we lived here for a very long time." Su Yurong did not walk into the fence. She looked at the somewhat dilapidated grass hut under the morning light and calmly said, "Sometimes when I think about it, I'm really curious. Back then, you and the seniors of the Mount Li sword sect were like fire and water, yet you had to stay under the same roof. Didn't you fight every night?" Chen Changsheng said, "Go Hanshi was a modest gentleman." Su Yurong said, "But Senior didn't have such a good temper." Chen Changsheng thought about the first night, when Tang 36 and Guan Fei by almost fought over a clean bed and laughed. The grand examination will start the day after tomorrow. Right now, the Mausoleum of Books is still very quiet. He looked at Su Yurong and said, "This is really a good idea." The rumors in the capital were boiling. Although they were basically making fun of Chen Changsheng, for Su Yurong, it was also a kind of trouble. It was difficult for the two to meet, and it was even more difficult for them to talk quietly. Her writing a letter to invite him to the Mausoleum of Books was indeed an excellent idea. Of course, to use the Mausoleum of Books, where the Xiuzha of the world struggled and worked so hard to enter, as a place for a date, was really a bit exaggerated. Only he and she could do it. Su Yurong saw that he understood her meaning and even said it out so directly. She felt a little embarrassed, but not angry. Because when Chen Changsheng said these words, his eyes were very clean and his expression was very sincere. He had passion, but under the calmness, his eyes were bright, but not burning. If Qiu Shanjun was said to be a sun, giving people warmth and heat, and being open and just to the extreme, Chen Changsheng was a cool breeze. Everyone liked the sun, but she liked to casually walk around in the cool breeze. In the middle of winter, the capital was already 10,000 li like silver, but the Mausoleum of Books was still lush and green. Walking in the forest between the mausoleum, all that brushed against one's face was the spring wind, extremely refreshing and pleasant. Chen Changsheng and Su Yurong walked along the mountain path towards the reflecting monolith hut. A middle-aged man appeared in the middle of the mountain path, blocking their path. That person's eyes were deep and serene. His cultivation was obviously very high. When he looked at Chun Chang-sheng, his eyes were filled with endless coldness. If one looked closely, they could even see a bit of hatred. Afterwards, I left for my hometown and drove back to the northeast. It might take half a month. These 2 days I've been desperately saving chapters, but I'm still not sure. Updating will slow down. Yes, of course, everyone knows that I'm a nervous person. If there is a second update every day, I will report it to everyone. If there isn't, then it will be the first update, just like before. Thank you. Chapter 551. Jijin came from Scholatry Manor in the south. He had sworn a blood oath to become a monolith guardian that he could never leave the mausoleum of books for the rest of his life. Last year, this person had attempted to help the Scholatry Manor disciple Zhong Hui surpass Chun Changsheng and Go Hanshi in comprehending the monoliths. He had ridiculed and reprimanded Chun Changsheng and Go Hanshi's method of comprehending the monoliths. But in the end, he had been silently humiliated by Chun Changsheng and Go Hanshi. Jijin stared at Chun Changsheng, his eyes filled with hostility and resentment. Although, as a monolith guardian, he could never leave the mausoleum of books, he was not cut off from the world. News from outside the mausoleum of books gradually reached his ears. Chun Changsheng had comprehended the entire front mausoleum in a single day. He had become the youngest principal of the Orthodox Academy. He had gone to the Garden of Zhou. He might have died, but had come back to life. He had journeyed south with Su Li. His cultivation of the sword had advanced by leaps and bounds, breaking in his star condensation and defeating the proud son of heaven, Su Yurong, on the bridge of helplessness. He had finally been confirmed as the successor to the orthodoxy. The disciple from Scholatry Manor, Zhong Hui, whom he had placed high hopes on, had obtained third place upon the first banner in the previous year's grand examination, below Chun Changsheng and Go Hanshi. In a short span of a year, he had obtained an enormous improvement, shocking the entire South. But how could he compare to Chun Changsheng? Crucially, this was the mausoleum of books that he had willingly offered up his life and freedom for. Just what right do you have to come and go as you please? Su Yurong did not recognize Jijin, but she could sense that this monolith guardian with such a profound cultivation clearly held hostility towards Qin Changsheng. Qin Changsheng roughly understood where Jijin's anger came from. He slightly bowed, but said nothing. Logically speaking, it should have been Jijin bowing to him, but he thought that Jijin's age and seniority were both here, so he bowed first. Yet Jijin still had no intention of bowing to him. He only stared at him. Su Yurong's expression was very calm, but her eyes gradually brightened as she looked at Jijin. Chun Changsheng shook his head and brought her along the other side of the mountain path. Jijin's hands, which were exposed outside of his sleeves, were slightly trembling. Especially when Chun Changsheng and Su Yurong brushed past him, his veins popped out. In the end, he did nothing because he did not dare. These years, he had been very depressed. He really wanted to vent, and Chun Changsheng was naturally the best target. But while he was in the mausoleum of books, his family and Scholatry Manor were still outside. If he did not want his family and Scholatry Manor to be burned to ashes by the furious flames of the orthodoxy, then there was nothing he could do. He didn't have to bow to Qin Changsheng, but he couldn't attack Qin Changsheng. The sun gradually rose, and the snowy clouds dispersed. The capital in winter had a different kind of beauty, with a sense of spaciousness. Standing next to the forest in the middle of the mausoleum and looking at the distant streets of the capital, Chun Changsheng remembered the time when he and Luo stood on the banyan tree and looked at the streets in the Tradition Academy. He said, "I once asked Luo to help me investigate information about you. Since now that I've found you, I feel that I should tell her about this, so I mentioned it to her in the letter." Su Yurong softly said, "Back in Mount Li, when I first thought you were dead, I told Senior about what happened in the Garden of Zhou. Senior was a little worried about me, so after eating beef ribs a few days ago, I wrote a letter to him. They had met on the bridge of helplessness that day, and then they ate beef ribs in a pot. They had confirmed a few things, so they felt that they should confirm a few other things. This was a very responsible attitude. Although they had no experience in this aspect, nor did they think too much about the specifics, they still did this. Mentioning these two letters at this time was naturally another way to express his sincerity. From the Garden of Zhou until now, they had expressed their feelings many times, but those methods were rather special, like brushing the snow, touching their shoulders, or writing letters to others. Qin Changsheng's eyes were very clear, like a small stream. It was very easy to see those happy expressions that swam like fish. Su Yurong softly said, "I had you come to the mausoleum of books not for, but for proper business." Her words had an unexpressed meaning. The not for in her words actually meant that it was not just for this. Meeting in the mausoleum of books, what proper business could there be? Naturally, it was the matter of the heavenly tome monoliths. Behind them was the reflecting monolith hut. On the black monolith, those poems were so clear, but those lines were still so difficult to understand. Chun Changsheng walked up to the monolith hut and thought back to the time he had spent viewing the monoliths last year. At that time, I was cooking in the grass hut, and I saw the light fall on the fence. He recounted his experiences of viewing the monoliths and comprehending the Tao, as well as several methods, without holding anything back. Su Yurong quietly listened, her hands behind her gently trembling in the cool breeze, as if she was pushing the faded star plate, incessantly deducing according to his words. When Chun Changsheng finished, she began to recount her first experience of viewing the reflecting monolith and what she had learned. So in essence, the so-called thickness is also a change in the light. Qin Changsheng was somewhat uncertain. The brushstrokes of the rubbings have always been different. Won't the meaning be lost because of the shape? Su Yurong replied, "The rubbings of the heavenly tome monoliths preserved by South Stream Temple were made by the first holy maiden using the heart of the heavens to imprint it on her soul. Then she turned it over to the monoliths, and only 2 or 3 of its true meaning remained." Hearing this, Qin Changsheng could not help but feel a boundless reverence towards the holy maiden who had founded the southern faction of the orthodoxy. 2 or 3 true meanings could be stored. This sounded like a rather wretched ratio, but it must be known that the true meanings here were the true meanings of the heavenly tome monoliths. That first holy maiden had actually been able to directly imprint those true meanings into her soul, and even reconstruct them into lines and shapes. This could truly be considered a great divine ability. These kinds of rubbings of the heavenly tome monoliths were naturally completely different from the rubbings sold by the peddlers in front of the Plum Garden Inn. And I wasn't talking about rubbings just now, Su Yurong said. The thickness I was talking about was the thickness of the brush strokes on the heavenly tome monoliths. Qin Changsheng did not quite understand. He asked, "You've come to the mausoleum of books to view the monoliths?" Su Yurong was somewhat embarrassed. "When I was 5, the Empress carried me here." Qin Changsheng was silent. He thought to himself, she really is a person that makes people speechless. After viewing the reflecting monolith, they went to the second heavenly tome monolith. Occasionally, they would see a few monolith viewers, but there were not many of them. Moreover, those people had remained in the mausoleum of books for many years, and their Tao hearts had long since become silent. Their attention was only on the monoliths, and they did not notice their arrival. The two casually strolled through the mausoleum, exchanging their experiences and comprehensions from viewing the monoliths. Comparing their experiences with each other, they each benefited from it. By the time they arrived in front of the broken monolith, the winter sun had already reached its zenith. There was not a single person in front of the monolith hut. Qin Changsheng walked into the hut and looked at the broken monolith in silence. Su Yurong walked to his side, looked at him, and shook her head. In a soft but firm voice, she said, "Don't, for the sake of thanking a certain reader, and also because I can't stand the loneliness, I can't keep the sesame oil, and I can't keep the manuscript." There's a chapter at 8 in the evening. Chapter 552. Don't do what? Qin Changsheng naturally understood. After a moment of silence, he nodded. This broken monolith had been severed by Zhou Dufu. The heavenly tome monolith that had originally been here had been taken away by him, probably placed in the Garden of Zhou. This also meant that it was extremely likely that the heavenly tome monolith was currently on his and Su Yorong's bodies. The moment he saw the broken monolith, he felt an intense desire to see the complete heavenly tome monolith. He wanted to test which of the two beads was the heavenly tome monolith, and then reattach it. Su Yorong did not let him do this, because she was keenly aware that the return of the heavenly tome monolith to the old mausoleum would definitely cause the heavens and earth to change color, and all the experts of the world would sense it. There are a total of 11 heavenly tome monoliths in the outside world. He looked at the peak of the mausoleum of books and whispered, "If the front mausoleum is divided by the broken monolith, doesn't that mean that this place is divided into 12 mausoleums?" The mausoleum of books was a very mysterious place. The peak seemed to be very close, yet so far that it seemed to touch the sky. Chun Changsheng and Su Yurong both knew that before Zhou Dufu seized these heavenly tome monoliths, the mausoleum of books did not actually have a front mausoleum. Su Yurong said, "You can ask someone about these things." Chun Changsheng was slightly surprised and said, "Ask who?" "I asked her ladyship, but she refused to tell me." Su Yurong gazed at a certain place below the mausoleum of books. "But there are definitely others who know." Chun Changsheng asked, "When do we start?" Su Yurong lifted the front of her robe and sat cross-legged in front of the monolith hut. She then extended her hand and invited him to sit on the grass to her right. Her slender fingers, separated by a distance of several feet, fell on the remnants of the broken monolith. Her brush moved like the wind, turning into words one after another. She wrote very quickly, but there was absolutely no break between her strokes. It was extremely clear, just like the sword that had broken through the wind and snow on the bridge of helplessness. Even a saint who had stepped into the divine domain would probably only be able to faintly catch a trace or two of the marks left behind by her fingers, unable to see them clearly. The only one who could see those words clearly was Chun Changsheng, who was sitting beside her on the grass. After she finished writing, it was Chun Changsheng's turn. His fingers were extremely steady, each stroke was like a chisel. The finger pierced through the air, bringing with it the wind. After the wind dispersed, the traces would naturally disappear. As for the broken tablet, it was even more impossible for anything to be left behind. Chun Changsheng and Su Yurong, on the other hand, were very focused and serious as they looked at the broken monolith. That was because they had memorized all the words that had just been written. The handwriting was both words and pictures. The having saber art was divided into 3 parts, 108 moves. Back in the Garden of Zhou, when the Black Nightmare coffin had been opened, they had discovered the world's most famous and most powerful blade style. The blade technique left behind by Zhou Dufu was extremely mystical. The 108 blades seemed to be individual blade techniques, but in reality, they were a whole. Only by completely grasping all 108 blades could one truly understand the true meaning of the having blade technique. At that time, Su Yurong had brought the monster tide to attack. They did not have enough time, so they could only split up and memorize it. Su Yurong memorized it from the front, memorizing 37 moves, while Chun Changsheng memorized it from the back, memorizing 69 moves. Afterwards, just as their shoulders met and they smiled at each other, the having blade style on the coffin wall disappeared without a trace. What did this mean? It meant that only the two of them could make the having blade style reappear in the world. After leaving the Garden of Zhou, they had both attempted to copy down these blade styles, but to their shock, they discovered that when Zhou Dufu had carved the blade style on the coffin wall, it actually contained some of the mysteries of the heavenly tome monoliths. With their current level of cultivation, it was simply impossible for them to reproduce those lines in their sea of consciousness on paper. What did this mean? It meant that only when the two of them were together could they practice the having blade style. Back in the mausoleum of Zhou, Chun Changsheng had said, "Let us practice together." Now it seemed that this sentence was truly an incomparably accurate prophecy. After a very, very long time, they had finally reunited. They finally had the chance to practice this blade style together. The broken monolith under the hut had been cut in half by Zhou Dufu using the having blade. Although it had been battered by wind and rain for hundreds or even thousands of years, it still retained some of its blade intent. In front of the broken monolith, a peerless divine technique, like the having blade style, reappeared. Comprehending it and then cultivating it, there was nothing more perfect than this. They had obviously entered the mausoleum of books for proper business. Time slowly passed. The winter sun slowly moved. The area in front of the broken monolith hut was quiet. On the high platform that connected to the sky, under the sky that was divided by the courtyard, in front of the clear canal, several pairs of eyes fell upon this place. The young man and woman, shoulder to shoulder, quietly sat in the grass. From anyone's point of view, this was clearly a romance. Who could have imagined that they were learning the blade, cultivating the Tao? Of course, learning the blade and cultivating the Tao could also be the method they were using to talk about love. The 10 heavenly tome monoliths, the secret of the Garden of Zhou, the confrontation between the two factions. There were far too many reasons for Chen Changsheng and Su Yurong to be wary and worried about each other. Let alone love, in the long river of history, father and son killing each other, husband and wife falling out, had already happened far too many times. Those people were all truly powerful figures, all of them possessing discerning eyes that could see through the mortal world. But in the end, they had still sunk into the quagmire of mutual harm. Why? Because those benefits had already surpassed the limits of the mortal world. Fortunately, the 10 heavenly tome monoliths, the secret of the Garden of Zhou, the peerless divine technique that could only be cultivated together. There were far too many similar or different reasons that made it seem as if they were destined to be inseparable in this life. Viewing the heavenly tome monoliths, comprehending the having blade, reading the scroll of time, thinking about how to break the array left behind by Wang Jitze, time passed very quickly. The appointment in the mausoleum of books had ended, and the two of them had gained a deeper understanding of the heavenly tome. They had finally turned the having blade into true knowledge. Although they had not completely grasped the scroll of time, they had spent a beautiful period of time together. They left the broken monolith hut, but did not directly leave the mausoleum. Instead, they followed the path at the foot of the mausoleum, heading south to the shallow canal. The shallow and clear canal passed through the stone plain, forming an extremely complex diagram. Above them, at the foot of the mountain, was an extremely simple mountain path. The mountain path was extremely straight, leading from the foot of the mountain to the highest peak. The stone steps were made of white stone. This was the legendary divine path. Chen Changsheng was not unfamiliar with this scenery and diagram. Back then, on the first day he had entered the mausoleum, he had come here. On that night, he and his companions had seen Sun Mei wake up from his dream of the mausoleum. He had left the small courtyard and come here. He had stepped over the shallow waters of the canal, crushed the traces of stars in the water, and walked towards the pavilion. He wanted to use this divine path to reach the peak of the mausoleum. Then, he had fallen into Chen Changsheng's bosom. Sun Mei's resolute advance towards the divine path had left him, Go Hanshi, and the others, with a mental impact that was difficult to erase. It was even more important than the notebook he had left behind for them. Looking at the perfectly straight divine path between the cliffs and the seemingly incomparably distant peak that seemed to touch the vault of heaven, Chen Changsheng was silent. He thought that there would be a day when he would walk up from here. If he wanted to walk up the divine path, he needed to pass through the pavilion. Under the pavilion was a person. His entire body was covered in heavy and old-fashioned armor. Even his face and hands were covered in rusted metal. He looked like a statue, but he did not give off a deathly stillness. He only gave off an incomparably ancient feeling. When I first came up with the name of the chapter, I almost wrote that word. TSK. Luckily, I realized it quickly. Chapter 553. A few days ago, Su Yurong had said that if he wanted to know the situation in the mausoleum of books, he could ask someone. Even if the Divine Empress did not say it, there would definitely be people who knew. Since it was a matter of the mausoleum of books, who in the world could understand it better than this person? This person had already sat in the mausoleum of books for several hundred years. She and Chun Chong Sheng walked across the clear water and arrived in front of the pavilion. She bowed to the person under the pavilion. There were already very few people in the world who were qualified for her and Chun Chong Sheng to bow at the same time. But the person under the pavilion was different. The continent's #1 divine general, Han Qing, had an extremely high seniority, was the oldest, and had an extremely profound cultivation. Many years ago, he had already approached the divine domain and could be called invincible on the battlefield. He was the only person in the present world that could compare to those legendary divine generals of the past. People like Su Shiji and Shui, he simply could not compare, and not even the current storms of the 8 directions dare to say that they could definitely defeat him. What made people sigh in awe was that this person had guarded the mausoleum of books for several hundred years and had never left. It was as if he wanted to sit here until the end of his life. Hello, I am Su Yurong. I have come under the orders of my master to ask Senior a few questions. Su Yurong looked at the man in the armor and said softly. Due to being covered, there was no way to confirm whether the man within the armor had opened his eyes or not. But Chun Chong Sheng could clearly see that some dust suddenly flew out from the cracks of the armor, like tiny moths dancing under the sunlight. At the same time, he could clearly feel a pair of eyes that were like iron spears falling upon him, and Su Yurong. Who is your teacher? An old voice came from the depths of the armor. It seemed to be covered in rust, and seemed to have experienced the vicissitudes of life. Su Yurong replied, I come from South Stream Temple. South Stream Temple was divided into the outer sect and the inner sect, but only the current holy maiden or a direct descendant could walk in the name of South Stream Temple. The light of the winter sun fell on the surface of the armor, but it did not add warmth. Instead, it seemed even colder, just like the voice that came from the armor. Why didn't she come herself? My master said that her question was something that Senior couldn't answer back then, and she still can't answer it now. So she left this opportunity to me. Go ahead. Just how many heavenly tome monoliths were stolen from the mausoleum of books? Su Yurong's gaze fell on the divine general's armor through the flying dust and the winter sunlight. She was very calm and gentle, but her question was so direct and biting cold, as if the divine path at the southern foot of the mausoleum of books wanted to pierce through the heavens. Chun Chongsheng glanced at her and thought, Divine General Han Qing has guarded the mausoleum of books for several hundred years, guarding the divine path and secrets of the mausoleum of books. There are many heavenly tome monoliths that are not in the mausoleum of books, but have been lost outside. This is without a doubt the mausoleum of books' greatest secret. So how could he answer you? Unexpectedly, in the next moment, the old and cold voice came from the armor. 12. Upon hearing this answer, Chun Chongsheng was slightly shocked. Firstly, Divine General Han Qing was actually willing to answer this question, and secondly, the answer itself. He and Su Yurong glanced at each other and saw the astonishment in each other's eyes. There were 12 heavenly tome monoliths wandering about outside. All of them were taken by that person. Su Yurong continued to ask as she looked at the person under the pavilion. 11. What about the other one? Emperor Taizu took it away. Upon hearing this, Chun Chongsheng thought of the notebook that Wang Jitze had hidden in the pavilion of ascending mist. In the notebook, Wang Jitze had once mentioned that in his later years, Taizu had been imprisoned in the palace and indulged in sensual pleasures. In the end, he had given Chun Chongsheng an item. Zhou Dufu took away the heavenly tome monolith, so that's why the front mausoleum exists? Correct. So, the current mausoleum of books is actually 13 mausoleums. A broken monolith was a boundary monolith, so 12 monoliths were naturally 13 mausoleums. This was not a particularly difficult problem to calculate. Note, those heavenly tome monoliths, where are they now? Su Yurong finally asked the most crucial question. Before coming to the pavilion on the divine path, she and Chun Chongsheng had both believed that all the heavenly tome monoliths were in their hands, but now it seemed that this was not the case. No one knows where the heavenly tome monoliths that person took away are. Upon hearing the voice from the armor, Chun Chongsheng lowered his head in silence. He thought to himself, I know. But there is one heavenly tome monolith that should be in the demon lord's hands. Upon hearing this, Chen Changsheng and Su Yurong were finally shocked. The mountain mausoleum was silent. The clear and shallow water in the canals slowly flowed without any sound. Just what use did they have in taking away those heavenly tome monoliths? First of all, this has already exceeded the scope of what I originally promised Southstream Temple. Secondly, if I knew, would I have needed to sit here for several hundred years? After saying this, there was no more sound. The winter wind whistled through the pavilion, carrying with it the dust on the armor and ruffling the cold light. The divine general seemed to have once again become a statue. Leaving the pavilion and returning to Sun Mei's small courtyard, Chen Changsheng and Su Yurong looked at the plum blossoms outside the fence in silence for a while. At the very beginning, there were 11 heavenly tome monoliths around the mausoleum of Zhou. If the heavenly tome monolith that Wang Jitze obtained from Emperor Taizu was not originally there, then it also means that we guessed wrong from the very beginning. The person who entered the garden of Zhou and took away that heavenly tome monolith, forcing Zhou Dufu to use 10,000 swords to suppress it, was not Wang Jitze, but the Demon Lord. That heavenly tome monolith is currently in the Demon Lord's hands, and there are still 11 in our hands. Su Yurong turned around and softly said to him, "There's no need to worry too much." Besides Chen Changsheng, in this world, only she had personally seen the 10 heavenly tome monoliths around the mausoleum of Zhou, as well as the black stone that Chen Changsheng had taken out of his sheath. Since the garden of Zhou had reopened, Chen Changsheng should have had 11 heavenly tome monoliths in his hands, but on that night by the window of the imperial palace he had taken out 10. Su Yurong had never asked him where the other heavenly tome monolith was. She had a rough guess, and even if they split it equally according to Chen Changsheng's suggestion, they should have had 10. That black stone that Emperor Taizu had secretly given to Wang Jitze and then passed on to Chen Changsheng had originally been brought into the Garden of Zhou by him, so it was his own. I've never worried about getting lost in a world that I don't have the ability to enter. Chen Changsheng looked at her and said, "I'm just worried that you might bear some unnecessary pressure because of me." This was a problem that they had never discussed. Su Yurong was the current holy maiden of the South. Ever since she was a child, she had been regarded as the future leader of the human world. From the moment she was born, she was used to living with a sense of responsibility. Back then in the snowy temple of the plains of the unsetting sun, she had once said to him that this sort of life truly was rather tiring, but she was already used to it. The reappearance of the heavenly tome monoliths was an extremely important matter to the human world. It could even affect the comparison of strength between the humans and demons. With her Tao heart that embraced the world, if this matter were not related to Chen Changsheng, she would probably have already announced it to the world and then returned the heavenly tome monoliths to the mausoleum of books. On that snowy night, when Chen Changsheng placed the 5 stone pearls in her hands, he finally thought of this problem. He did not want her to bear this sort of pressure. No, in truth, in order to gather enough for the 13 mausoleums, I still very seriously checked and calculated. Then, I'll see you at 8. I'm really prepared to use up all my manuscripts at any moment. Chapter 554. I will learn to treat these stone pearls as beautiful ornaments, and not as heavenly tome monoliths. Su Yurong looked at him and calmly said, "And then, I'm a little hungry." Sun Mei's grass hut had been uninhabited for a very long time. It was very dusty, but all sorts of utensils were still present. Chen Changsheng went to the garden and picked 2 handfuls of vegetables, a dozen or so peppers, and cut up half of a piece of cured meat. He covered it in honey and steamed it. Together with white rice, it was a fragrant and sweet meal. Su Yurong was very satisfied with the meal, but she was a little embarrassed. Afterwards, they discussed the grand examination and next year's Boiling Stone Summit, as well as how to leave the Mausoleum of Books. In order to prevent others from seeing them and guessing what was going on, which would make the rumors in the capital even more fervent, the two decided to leave separately. Su Yurong would leave first, while Chen Changsheng would stay in the Mausoleum of Books for another day. However, they did not think that this was a complete cover-up. How could it be hidden from others? In other words, this was called deceiving oneself while stealing a bell. However, before Su Yurong had time to leave, the small courtyard welcomed an uninvited guest. The guest was the monolith guardian from Scholartree Manor, Ji Jin. Perhaps because he recognized Su Yurong's identity, or perhaps because he had guessed at something, he stood by the fence. His expression was somewhat lonely, his face somewhat pale, and the resentment and unwillingness in his eyes had disappeared. It was very complicated, but indescribable. Chun Changsheng prepared to say something, but Su Yurong indicated for him to wait a moment. Her sleeves fluttered as she walked to the fence. She looked at Ji Jin with an indifferent expression and said, "I will request that your qualifications as a monolith guardian be revoked and that you be expelled from the mausoleum of books." Sunlight seeped through the branches of the plum trees in the orange grove and fell on her face. That extremely beautiful face immediately added a sense of holiness and solemnity, because when she said those words, she was the aloof holy maiden of the South. To become a monolith guardian of the mausoleum of books was an extremely difficult task. One needed to make an extremely extreme blood oath, one that seemed to contain the power of the heavenly Tao. Once they swore a blood oath and became a monolith guardian, they would obtain the freedom that cultivators yearn for day and night, the freedom to interact with the heavenly tome monoliths. At the same time, they would also lose the freedom to leave the mausoleum of books. For the rest of their lives, they could only study the heavenly tome monoliths in the mausoleum of books and study. They could not take a step out of the mausoleum of books. Countless years had passed since the orthodoxy had set down this rule, but there had only been one exception. That was when Su Li had charged into the mausoleum of books, berated the two monolith guardians from the Mount Li sword sect, and then forcefully brought them back to Mount Li. Those two monolith guardians were the two elders of Mount Li's discipline hall, and they were also one of the main reasons for Mount Li's internal strife. The allure of the mausoleum of books to cultivators was far too great. It was like a beautiful dream that could not be ended. The more profound one's Tao was, the longer one studied the heavenly tome monoliths, the more reluctant one was to leave. Even Sun Mei, who was a great cultivator with extraordinary talent, needed several tens of years to wake up. To cancel the blood oath of a monolith guardian and expel him from the mausoleum of books, only the Pope and the Holy Maiden had the right to do so. Moreover, the monolith guardian would suffer the backlash of the blood oath, which would be extremely painful. Hearing Su Yurong's words and seeing Ji Jin's face instantly pale and his body incessantly trembling, Qin Changxing grew wary. In his view, Ji Jin had suffered such humiliation and such a heavy punishment. He would assuredly be enraged to the extreme, perhaps even go crazy and attack Su Yurong. However, Ji Jin did not attack in rage. After a while, he gradually calmed down and bowed to Su Yurong through the fence. He clasped his hands to the ground, appearing incomparably respectful. His voice was somewhat trembling, very excited, and also somewhat perplexed. "Many thanks for the Holy Maiden's pity. Ji Jin is endlessly grateful and will definitely repay it with his life." Seeing Ji Jin's figure gradually vanish into the forest, Chen Changsheng was somewhat confused. "Why?" "Because he wants to leave. I hear the backlash of the blood oath is very frightening. In the end, it's even more frightening than not having freedom. But didn't they become monolith guardians of their own volition? As time passes, a person's thoughts will often undergo changes that they would have never imagined at the beginning." Su Yurong walked up to his side and said, "To many cultivators, the mausoleum of books is the most beautiful dream, and also the longest imprisonment." Chun Changsheng faintly remembered that he had once heard a similar saying. She continued, "In truth, I had this idea a long time ago. I was prepared to persuade the martial uncles of the temple to discuss with the Li Palace and change this rule." Chun Changsheng gazed at her incomparably elegant face and felt that she was becoming more and more beautiful. He sincerely said, "You are a good person." Then he added, "If the Li Palace does not agree to South Stream Temple's request, once I become Pope, I will also strive to abolish this rule." Su Yurong softly said, You are also a good person. On the next day, Chun Changsheng left the mausoleum of books. Under the escort of several cardinals, he returned to the Orthodox Academy. At this time, the morning light was bright and the western sky was as dark as night. It was still very early. He was preparing to go across the lake to the newly repaired kitchen to find Xian Yuan Pa for some food, but he suddenly saw a completely unexpected person on the great banyan tree. He couldn't help but ask in surprise, what happened? Apart from a few special circumstances, Tang 36 would never get up so early, but at this time he was standing on the arm of the great banyan tree, gazing into the distance. Whether it was because he hadn't slept all night or something else, he didn't look at Chun Changsheng. He continued gazing into the distance, his expression indifferent as he asked, "Do you know what the most painful thing in the world is?" Chun Changsheng shook his head. Tang 36 sneered, "The most painful thing in the world is when all of us are as tired as pigs and dogs, yet some people still have the leisure to go on dates. Moreover, you have to keep a certain person's secret. Not bad to actually have a rendezvous in the mausoleum of books." After the Orthodox Academy accepted new students, the first test the new students faced was the grand examination. For the sake of the upcoming grand examination, both Tang 36 and Su Mo were extremely busy. Even Zhixio would occasionally give lessons to the students, using pain and blood to teach them what true battle was. Yet Chun Changsheng, as the principal of the Orthodox Academy, paid no attention to this matter. Tang 36's true pain still had to be related to keeping a secret. Chun Changsheng and Su Yurong had gotten to know each other in the Garden of Zhou. They had feelings for each other and would often meet in private. This secret was something that only he knew of in the capital. Once a secret was known, the person with the secret would often become much more relaxed, just like Chun Changsheng and Su Yurong in the past few days. But the person who knew the secret but could not speak of it to others would inherit their pain and pressure, perhaps even a little more. Rumors spread throughout the capital. Everyone said that Chun Changsheng was bitterly in love with Su Yurong but could not. Tang 36 wanted nothing more than a spit on those people's faces. He wanted nothing more than to reopen Clear Lake Restaurant and stand on the roof to tell this story to the tens of thousands of people, to announce the secret of those two to the world. But he could not do this, so he was in great pain, even somewhat angry. Chun Changsheng looked at him and said in confusion, "Back then, it was you who said that I had to endure it." Tang 36 looked at him and said, "But I'm almost unable to endure it anymore."